Hi folks, today we are going to wander back through the winding corridors of time into an age where justice was painted in darker, more visceral strokes than we might ever imagine today. An age when law was not merely a matter of courtrooms and judges in powdered wigs, but a deeply woven tapestry of customs, divine fear, feudal duty, and sometimes chilling spectacle. But before you truly settle in and let this story carry you off into the shadowed streets and echoing halls of medieval Europe, take a moment to help this humble storyteller out. If you find yourself even slightly leaning in with curiosity, if your heart beats a touch quicker as we prepare to open these old creaky doors of history, then gently tap that like button. Only, of course, if you genuinely like what we do here, I'd also be truly glad to know exactly where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there right now. Is it the dark of midnight or a lazy afternoon sun spilling across your floor? Please let me know in the comments. It's always a small wonder to think of all the souls these stories reach and how far these words travel, comforting and educating folks from all corners of the world. Regardless of where you are or who you are, I want you to know this. I appreciate you. Your simple act of watching, of spending these moments with me, matters more than you might guess. And if, by the end of our long wandering today, you find yourself truly enjoying our tales, and you feel these stories are something you'd like to keep hearing, then don't forget to subscribe. Maybe even share it with someone else who loves a good haunting thread of history. Every little action, from liking to subscribing to sharing, sends a quiet ripple back to me, encouraging me to keep searching out these stories and keep telling them gently to you. So, with that small request nestled in your mind, take a slow breath, settle your shoulders, maybe even brew yourself something warm, because the roads we're about to travel are old, and the lantern light is dim, and there is much to see. Imagine, if you will, the fading shadow of Rome across the European continent. The mighty empire that had once stretched its marble roads and iron discipline across countless tribes and kingdoms was crumbling, slowly, inevitably. Its legions withdrawing, its governors departing, its great stone cities echoing emptier by the year. Where once there had been the proud codes of Roman law, detailed statutes, magistrates in togas, notaries scratching out edicts on wax tablets, there was now uncertainty. The people left behind, from the misty isles of Britannia to the sunlit vineyards of Gaul, found that Roman courts grew silent. The old imperial system, with its elaborate legal procedures, simply couldn't survive without the empire's machinery to keep it running. In this vacuum, something older, almost more primal, began to emerge again. The tribal customs of the Germanic peoples, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, Visigoths, crept forward to take the place of Roman law. These were not laws written on grand tablets in marble halls. They were living memories, carried in the minds of elders, sung by poets, passed from father to son. One of the most vivid features of these early tribal codes was wergild, literally man price. If a man was killed, his family was owed a payment by the killer or the killer's kin. A price was fixed not by the crime in abstract, but by the worth of the victim. A nobleman's life cost more than a freeman's, a freeman more than a serf. A chilling arithmetic, perhaps, yet in their eyes it was a way to curb the endless cycles of revenge that might otherwise tear families and villages apart. But when wergild failed, when payments were refused, or insults struck too deep, blood feuds blossomed. Entire lineages might be drawn into these spirals of vengeance, each blow demanding another, and so the early medieval landscape was sometimes as much a tapestry of grudges and obligations as it was of fields and forests. Justice in these centuries was also a communal affair, woven together by compurgation, a practice that might seem quaint or even absurd to modern eyes. If you were accused of theft, say, you could gather 12 of your neighbours or kinsmen who would swear solemn oaths on your innocence. Their honour stood as collateral for your truth. If they vouched for you, the matter might be settled then and there. The weight of one's social network, of one's reputation in the village, mattered more than any distant written code. And so justice was not an impersonal force. It was bound up in relationships, obligations, and the delicate dance of communal trust. It was noisy gatherings in village commons, chieftains or elders listening with patient or impatient ears, and disputes settled not by abstract principles but by the standing of your kin and the willingness of your neighbours to stake their own souls on your honesty. From these humble, deeply human proceedings, we see the fragile birth of medieval justice, and yet, when mere oaths and payments could not decide a matter, they often turned to something far more grave. Imagine standing barefoot upon damp earth, the cold seeping into your bones, the eyes of your entire village upon you. A small brazier glows nearby, iron rods heating in the coals until they shimmer with a sinister orange light. Somewhere, a priest intones a prayer, asking God himself to reveal the truth. This was the ordeal by hot iron, one of the ways early medieval communities sought divine judgment when human judgment failed. You, the accused, would take up that glowing bar and carry it for 3 paces, or press it to your palm. Your flesh would sear, blister, crack. Then your hand would be bound and wrapped. Several days later it would be unwrapped before the assembled village. If your burns were clean, if infection had not set in, they would say God had protected you, that you were innocent. The ordeal by hot water was scarcely kinder. A cauldron would be brought to a boil, sometimes blessed with solemn chants. A stone or ring would be cast to the bottom. You would plunge your arm in to retrieve it. Once again, the healing of your scalded flesh was taken as the divine verdict. Then there was the ordeal by cold water, almost paradoxical in its logic. You would be bound, often at wrist and ankle, and lowered into a pond or river. Water, thought to be a pure element, would reject the guilty. If you floated, you were considered to be repelled by the very purity of the water, a sure sign of guilt. If you sank, you were innocent, though sometimes the innocent drowned before they could be pulled out. What seems cruel or even superstitious to us was, in their eyes, a desperate appeal to the highest court, God himself. In a world with few professional judges, no forensic science, no fingerprinting or careful investigations, how else to pierce the veil of uncertainty? The ordeal was a solemn, terrifying ritual, surrounded by prayer, the sign of the cross, holy relics brought forth, all to summon divine intervention. And the Church, in these early centuries, generally endorsed such practices. After all, if God ruled all things, why would he not also guide the hand of fate in these moments of greatest peril? The ordeal was more than punishment or proof. It was a ritual to cleanse the community of doubt, to restore harmony where suspicion might otherwise fester and rot. Thus, across the forests and fields of early medieval Europe, you could hear the echo of these ancient judgments, the hiss of hot iron, the gasps of onlookers as an arm plunged into boiling water, the solemn chanting over riverbanks, each one a small drama of mortal fear and divine scrutiny. As we drift forward through the centuries toward the close of this first millennium, a new shape began to emerge on the landscape of justice. the fractured, overlapping authority of early feudal lords. The might of Rome was long gone, replaced by a patchwork of petty kingdoms and baronies, each ruled by its own strongman, its own network of oaths and allegiances. Justice was administered on a profoundly local scale. A peasant who stole a neighbour's cow, or who was caught poaching on the lord's land, would not travel to any distant royal court. Instead, he would stand before the manor court, held in a dusty hall, or even beneath a great oak. The local lord or his steward presided, perhaps leaning on a sword or sipping ale, deciding the fate of his subjects with a blend of stern paternalism and practical concern for the peace of his domain. Punishments varied wildly, often at the lord's personal discretion. Some crimes demanded compensation, a return to the old were-guild traditions. Others might be met with corporal punishments, floggings administered in front of gathered villagers, ears cropped or noses slit so the crime would mark the body forever, a living billboard of shame. Imprisonment, oddly enough, was rare. Few lords wanted the expense or trouble of keeping captives. Far easier to exact a fine, or scar a man so he'd remember. Yet even in these rough courts, there was a logic, a striving toward balance. The Lord sought to keep peace among his people, to maintain order so that fields could be ploughed, taxes collected, prayers offered, without fear of feuds or lawlessness tearing the fabric of his little realm. And so, in the dim wooden halls of these manor courts, under banners bearing a boar's head or a lion rampant, justice was often rendered with an intimacy that might unsettle us today. The accused was usually known to all, a neighbour, a distant cousin, someone seen at Mass each Sunday. This closeness meant that judgments could be both compassionate and frighteningly arbitrary. A lord who valued order might be swift to punish a thief with a flogging to set an example, but the same lord might also show leniency to a family he favoured, waiving fines or granting mercy for reasons known only to his own heart. This was a justice of faces and names, not of faceless bureaucracy. Witnesses came forward not out of civic duty, but because they were bound by kinship and fear of local gossip. The entire community became a theatre of moral lessons, each punishment a cautionary tale retold at hearths and in the fields. And through it all, one sees how compensation and corporal punishment remained far more common than imprisonment. A lord might find it far more practical to exact silver pennies or goats in recompense than to house a man behind bars, feeding him daily while he contributed nothing to the manor's labours. Thus was born a culture where justice was immediate and visible, debts paid in coin or blood, bodies scarred as living records of wrongdoing. Even so, these local courts were not lawless. There were codes customary and evolving, whispered into existence by countless generations. They were not written with the grandeur of Roman law, but they lived in the collective memory, enforced by fear of dishonour or of harsh reprisal, and hovering always at the edges was the shadow of the sacred, oaths sworn on relics, the fear of eternal damnation if one lied under the watchful eyes of both neighbours and God. As we approach the close of this first great chapter of medieval justice, we see a world still caught between the fading echoes of Roman order and the raw immediacy of feudal power. It was a justice grounded in community reputation, in the physicality of punishment, and in the ever-present belief that the divine played an intimate role in human affairs. Whether through the healing of burns after an ordeal, or the solemn oaths sworn before relics of saints, it was a harsh world, yes, but in its own way, it was also deeply concerned with maintaining peace. with stitching back together the torn fabric of small societies after thefts, feuds, or sudden violence. Each settlement, each tiny lordship, was a fragile organism that could not afford long simmering resentments. And so justice, brutal and uneven as it might seem to us, served the vital function of restoring balance, of ensuring that neighbours might still work side by side when the sowing season came. This is where we leave the earliest centuries of medieval justice, at the cusp of the year 1000. The roads that once carried Roman judges now carried pilgrims and merchants. The old stone amphitheatres lay choked with weeds, while wooden gallows rose on village greens. Justice had become local, personal, drenched in ritual and superstition, yet always circling back to the same fragile aim, the survival and uneasy harmony of the community. As we step gently into the next century of our long medieval journey, a subtle transformation begins to colour the way justice was pursued. Where once justice was chiefly the business of lords, kin, and village assemblies under the open sky, a new and far-reaching authority gradually spread its influence: the Holy Church. By the 11th century, the Church's power was no longer confined to the spiritual shepherding of souls. It had grown into a mighty institution with lands, armies, wealth, and increasingly its own courts of law. These were the ecclesiastical courts, born out of the conviction that clergy and matters of the soul lay outside the rough hands of secular lords. In these church courts, the accused might stand not before a mailed knight or a feudal baron, but before bishops, archdeacons, or learned clerics robed in black and crimson, seated in dim halls fragrant with incense. The cases they heard ranged widely, from disputes over tithes and church lands, to offences committed by priests or monks, to breaches of Christian morality among the laity. Perhaps most significant was the benefit of clergy. This rule held that any ordained cleric, or even someone who could merely read Latin well enough to recite a psalm, might claim exemption from the harsh judgments of secular courts. A man accused of theft or assault could stand before the magistrate, speak the words of the neck verse from the Psalms, and if he managed it without stumbling, he might be handed over to a church court for a more lenient judgment. This was no small thing, for in the eyes of church courts, punishment was ideally not about inflicting pain or shame on the body, but about guiding the soul back to God's grace. The clergy who judged such cases saw themselves as healers more than executioners, and so, where a secular court might lop off a hand for theft, an ecclesiastical court might instead demand penance, prayer, or restitution. This dual system of justice sometimes led to bitter friction. Lords resented seeing serious criminals slip through their grasp by claiming clerical status, and kings fretted over the erosion of royal authority. Yet for many ordinary folk, the shadowy promise of the Church's gentler hand offered a fragile hope, if they could but find sanctuary under its wide, holy wings. And so, across village greens and echoing cathedrals alike, the question of whose justice would prevail, God's ministers or the king's men, began to weave itself ever deeper into the fabric of medieval life. If you were hauled before an ecclesiastical court, found guilty of adultery, blasphemy, or failing to pay your tithes, it was unlikely you'd find yourself whipped or mutilated as in a secular tribunal. The church courts offered something different, and in many ways just as fearsome to the medieval mind. They prescribed penance. This could take many forms. You might be ordered to undertake a pilgrimage, travelling barefoot across muddy roads and treacherous mountain passes to some distant shrine. There, kneeling before a gilded reliquary, you would pour out your guilt and seek absolution. Such journeys were arduous, often perilous, exposing the penitent to disease, robbery, or worse. Yet they were also seen as profound acts of spiritual cleansing. Others were told to wear cross-shaped badges sewn onto their clothing, marking them unmistakably as sinners under correction. Wherever they went, to market, to church, to festivals, all eyes would note the symbol. Whispers would follow, reminding both the penitent and the community of the breach that had occurred. There were also public acts of humiliation and devotion. A man might be ordered to stand before the congregation clad in nothing but a simple shift, holding a heavy candle as the priest described his sin aloud. Some penances were more visceral still. Voluntary self-flagellation, the penitent lashing his own back until welts rose and blood trickled down, each stroke believed to scour the stain of sin from the soul. These were punishments aimed not merely at the body, but at the heart, meant to inspire genuine contrition. The Church's ideal was not retribution but moral correction. They sought to restore the sinner to the community, renewed and purified. It was, to medieval eyes, a deeply compassionate system, though to us, standing at such a vast distance in time, it also seems wrapped in psychological cruelty. For shame was a powerful currency, and to be marked publicly as a sinner could weigh on a family's name for generations. In these centuries, one's reputation was not merely personal, it was the very thread from which a family's future was woven. Through penance, the Church reinforced its role as both shepherd and watchman, guiding souls while also tightening its hold over the daily conduct of Christians. And with every candle carried, every pilgrimage footstep taken, the Church's vision of a morally ordered society found deeper roots. And yet not all sins were treated with such measured compassion. Some breaches threatened the very foundation of Christendom itself. By the close of the 12th century, the Church grew increasingly vigilant about a peril that lurked not in theft or adultery, but in heresy. The stubborn clinging to beliefs deemed false and dangerous. In these earlier centuries, however, heresy was often approached with a surprising gentleness. Church leaders saw it less as a crime deserving the sword, and more as a spiritual sickness to be healed. The ideal was conversion, persuasion, a bringing back into the fold through sermons and debates. Indeed, many bishops and monks took their time with suspected heretics, engaging them in disputations, urging them to recant, offering forgiveness. The Church feared the spread of error, certainly, but they feared even more the loss of a soul to eternal damnation. Thus their earliest measures were heavy on preaching and penance, light on chains and flames. Yet beneath this pastoral concern, a growing anxiety simmered. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century had shaken the Church to its core, aiming to purify it of corruption and assert its authority over secular rulers. In this new climate of rigorous orthodoxy, deviations of doctrine began to seem far more perilous, not just for the individual, but for the unity of Christendom itself. This tightening grip would, in later centuries, give rise to far harsher measures. But in these years around 1100, we still see the Church's justice as fundamentally oriented toward moral correction and spiritual reintegration, even when confronted by those who strayed dangerously from its teachings. And so, in dim chancels lit by wavering candles, bishops and archdeacons would sit in solemn councils, listening patiently to the doctrines of wandering preachers, trying to untangle honest confusion from willful heresy. At times, they might simply impose extended penance, ordering the errant soul to fast on bread and water, or to make a humble pilgrimage to the tomb of a saint. Other times they would impose a kind of social quarantine. The suspected heretic might be required to avoid gatherings, or to publicly renounce his false teachings before the entire congregation, standing on cold stone floors while the priest recited his errors from the pulpit. Meanwhile, for many ordinary people watching these proceedings, heresy was not an abstract theological error. It was a threat that could draw God's anger upon the entire community, inviting famine, plague, or military defeat as punishment for harboring unbelief. Thus, even as the Church preferred gentle correction, villagers might whisper anxiously, fearing that any unchecked heresy could pollute their lives with divine wrath. Gradually, one can sense a subtle hardening. The more the Church defined itself against corruption and secular interference, the more dangerous heresy appeared. If the purity of doctrine upheld the entire cosmic order, then any crack, however small, might spell disaster. This growing unease laid the groundwork for darker chapters still to come, when the healing hand of penance would give way to the iron grip of Inquisition and the scorching of flesh. But in this period, c. 1000 to 1200, the ecclesiastical arm of justice still mostly wore the robes of a physician rather than the mail of a soldier. Its courts hummed with talk of confession and redemption. Its punishments were devised to heal a broken relationship with God and neighbour, to stitch the penitent back into the moral fabric of society rather than to cast them forever into shadow. We have watched as ecclesiastical courts rose in prominence, offering a different kind of judgment, one focused on the soul's salvation rather than on bodily torment or the crude settlement of feuds. We've traced the solemn pathways of penance, barefoot pilgrims, penitential crosses sewn into tunics, the hush of congregations watching a sinner hold his candle high. And we've glimpsed the first cautious steps the Church took in addressing heresy, like a careful gardener pruning a sickly branch, anxious not to damage the tree. Yet as the years rolled on and Europe grew more entwined under the banners of monarchs and popes alike, justice itself began to evolve into something larger, more systematic, and in many ways more fearful. The 12th and 13th centuries would witness profound changes, legal codifications, royal ambitions, new anxieties over dissent, and a deepening belief that the authority to punish came directly from God's will, expressed through earthly kings. As our story continues to unfurl through the rugged tapestry of medieval Europe, we find ourselves walking narrow dirt roads that wind between towering forests and patchwork fields, past timbered halls and tiny hamlets that cluster under the protection of stone keeps. It is the age of feudalism in full flourish, where land is power and power is justice. In this world, the very structure of law and punishment mirrors the stratified layers of society. Justice is not a single, unified system, but rather a patchwork quilt sewn from countless local customs and the will of countless local lords. In the countryside, the heartbeat of this justice was often the manor court, held in the great hall of a lord's manor, or sometimes out in the open air under a spreading oak. These gatherings were as much communal affairs as they were legal proceedings. Villagers, tenants and serfs would file in, murmuring to one another, eyes darting to see who might stand accused that day. Here, the steward of the Lord presided over the cases, flanked by jurors drawn from among the villagers themselves. The crimes brought forward were mostly the humble wrongs of daily life, petty thefts of chickens or grain, neighbours brawling over land boundaries, drunken insults flung across alehouse benches. Fines were common, designed to restore the local peace and fill the Lord's coffers at the same time. But when darker offences stained the soil, robberies on lonely roads, brutal rapes in barn shadows, sudden murders that left bodies cooling in ditches, these were brought before higher feudal courts, or even the king's justices when they rode circuit through the shires. Such sessions were heavy with consequence, drawing larger crowds, thick with tension. It was a world where the personal authority of the Lord or the king's appointed men loomed vast. A peasant's life or death could hinge on the favour or the wrath of these rulers. Yet at the same time, the very localism of justice meant that communities often knew intimately both the victims and the accused. Every crime was not an abstract violation of law, but a tear in the delicate fabric of village relationships, something that might fester into long grudges or be mended by a fair verdict. Thus, under feudalism, justice wore many faces, sometimes paternal, sometimes cruel, but always close, immediate, bound tightly to the rhythms of rural life. Yet when it came time to punish, the methods employed could be shockingly harsh by our modern sensibilities. Medieval justice was deeply physical. It was believed that the body itself must bear the mark of wrongdoing, both as personal expiation and as a living warning to others. For theft, one of the most common offences, the penalties could be dreadfully maiming. A first conviction might see the thief's hand branded with a hot iron, the searing flesh forever testifying to his guilt. A repeat offence could cost him that very hand, hacked off at the wrist by the executioner's blade, or perhaps even a foot removed so he might never again flee his rightful duties. Ears were another frequent target. A man convicted of repeated disorder or lesser thefts might have the edges of his ears sliced away, or even have them cropped entirely, leaving grotesque stubs that all could see. The sight of such mutilation on village streets, men and women who carried their shame not just in memory but in mangled flesh, reinforced the law more effectively than any parchment decree. Branding was performed with grim ceremony. An iron rod, heated till it glowed a malevolent orange, would be pressed against the cheek, the shoulder, or even the forehead, raising a hiss of burning flesh and a scream that often echoed far beyond the walls of the courtyard. The pain was intense, but so too was the social penalty. For life thereafter, the branded man bore the indelible testimony of his crime wherever he went. Flogging and whipping were also common tools of correction. Stripped to the waist, the condemned would be tied to a stout post, or perhaps laid across a bench while the appointed beadle delivered strokes of the rod or lash. Sometimes this took place within the Lord's Hall before an audience of villagers. Other times it was conducted in the open square to maximize the spectacle. And alongside these agonies stood the stocks and pillories, wooden frames that locked heads, hands or feet, rendering the criminal helpless for hours or even days. Passers-by hurled insults, rotten vegetables, or worse. The intention was to degrade, to humble, to teach by vivid example what folly it was to defy the Lord's peace. In all these torments we glimpse a philosophy that wove together body, spirit and community. To hurt the flesh so the soul might be purged, to make of the transgressor a living billboard advertising the grim cost of sin. It is hard for us now, cushioned by modern sensibilities, to comprehend just how public medieval justice was. But in that age, punishment was never a private matter. It was theatre, a ritual woven into the social fabric, meant to instruct, to terrify, and ultimately to bind communities together around shared norms. Executions in particular were not sombre occasions reserved for shadowed prison courtyards. They were communal gatherings, events that drew crowds from miles around. Markets might spring up on execution day, vendors selling pies and ale while children played in the dust, waiting for the dreadful show. When the condemned was led forth, accompanied by priests chanting prayers for his soul, the mood could shift from carnival mirth to hushed solemnity in an instant. A hanging might be carried out from a sturdy oak or a hastily erected gallows in the village square. Headsman and rope were but parts of the larger moral lesson on display. The philosophy behind these grim spectacles was clear: deterrence through fear and shame. If men saw with their own eyes the body of a thief jerking at the end of a rope, or watched a woman accused of poisoning sway under the noose while her final prayers tangled in the breeze, they might think twice before straying from the path of lawful conduct. But there was more than fear. Such scenes also served to reknit the torn fabric of community, offering a kind of dark catharsis. The crime that had troubled the village, that had sparked whispers and stirred resentments, was at last expiated through the body of the criminal. Justice had been satisfied, order restored, and the people could return to their fields and hearths, feeling that the world, for now, was once again in balance. So the people watched, with hands clasped to mouths or eyes narrowed in grim approval. They watched as the condemned sometimes wept and begged for mercy, or else stood defiant, refusing even in those final moments to bow. They watched as the executioner adjusted the rope or tested the edge of his axe with a thumb, and they waited, breath held, for that instant when life was abruptly, irrevocably torn away. These moments, for all their horror, were strangely unifying. In small villages especially, where every person was bound by ties of kinship, trade, and feudal obligation, the spectacle of justice reminded all of the collective standards they lived by. Even children were brought to watch, so that the lesson might sink deep into tender hearts. The sight of a man swinging lifeless, or of a branded face trying to hide in shame, was more effective than any sermon. And punishment did not always end with death. After hangings, bodies might be left dangling for days, or gibbeted in iron cages along well-travelled roads. Crows clustered on outstretched arms, tearing at unresisting flesh. This macabre display served as a long-lasting warning, a silent sentinel proclaiming the Lord's justice to every passer-by. The message was unmistakable. Transgression brought not only swift but also lingering disgrace. Yet amidst these harsh realities there existed a paradoxical element of festivity. Execution days became local holidays of a sort, occasions when rural folk who lived scattered across fields and forests gathered together in the market square. Stalls sold pies hot from the oven, flagons of ale sloshed, gossip flowed as freely as the drink. It was brutal theatre, yes, but also communal reaffirmation, a shared acknowledgement of the rules that bound them all, the fragile order that kept the wolves of chaos at bay. And it is here, in these muddy squares thronging with villagers and merchants, priests intoning prayers while the crowd's murmur swelled, that we begin to glimpse the heart of medieval secular justice laid bare. It was intensely local, deeply embodied, and profoundly public. The punishments were not simply retribution, they were rituals designed to burn the lesson of obedience into both flesh and memory. Imagine the aftermath of one such day. As dusk fell and the people drifted homeward under a bruised sky, voices hushed and children clutching their mothers' hands a little tighter, the scaffold stood empty but not forgotten. The scent of blood and fear lingered on the air. Dogs sniffed at dark stains on the earth. Somewhere nearby, a village bell might toll for vespers, calling the faithful to pray, not only for the soul of the condemned, but perhaps also in relief that their own necks had been spared. And so we find ourselves, almost without realizing it, moving through time. The 12th and 13th centuries brought not only a flourishing of these feudal and local courts, but also laid foundations for something far broader. As kingdoms grew stronger and monarchs more ambitious, the machinery of justice began to shift. Kings wanted more than just scattered manor courts answering to petty lords. They sought uniformity, royal authority, the extension of their hand into every corner of their realm. At the same time, the church watched warily, anxious to maintain its spiritual jurisdiction even as secular rulers grew bolder. Conflicts arose over who could judge whom, over whether a bishop's court or a king's court should handle certain misdeeds, and all the while the philosophy of punishment itself began to evolve. No longer content simply to maim or terrify, justice turned increasingly to elaborate inquiries, recorded confessions, and even more public and more horrific executions aimed at demonstrating not just the power of local lords, but the absolute sovereignty of the crown. In this time, roughly from the 13th to the 14th century, a new kind of fear began to creep among the people. A fear not of the common thief or the belligerent drunkard, but of hidden enemies, whose crimes were whispered rather than witnessed. It was an age when faith and thought themselves became dangerous territories, and the punishments for straying from accepted belief could be as grim, if not grimmer, than those for spilling blood. It all began, as many such fearful things did, with a crisis of control. As the Church's power extended across the patchwork of kingdoms and duchies that made up Western Europe, it found itself ever more preoccupied with guarding the purity of its flock. The Gregorian reforms of the previous century had stirred both renewal and anxiety, planting seeds of vigilance against those who might undermine orthodoxy. By the early 1200s, formal machinery was put into place, the Inquisition. It emerged first in response to the Cathars of southern France, a group who preached a dualistic vision of the world, starkly opposed to the doctrines of Rome. Their rejection of sacraments and clerical wealth alarmed bishops and popes alike. Thus was born the idea of systematically rooting out heresy, not through chaotic mobs, but through appointed inquisitors vested with terrifying authority. These inquisitors travelled town to town, holding public sermons that urged people to denounce heretical neighbours or family members. Sometimes entire communities came under suspicion. Lists were drawn up and soon interrogations followed, held in dim ecclesiastical chambers where the air itself seemed heavy with judgment. The punishments at this stage were often not overtly bloody. The Church preferred penance to execution, at least at first. Those who confessed and recanted might be sentenced to fasting or to long pilgrimages to distant shrines. Others were made to wear distinctive crosses sewn into their garments so that all might see and shun them. Property was seized to pay fines or to support the machinery of investigation. And still others, judged unrepentant or relapsed, were handed over to secular authorities under the chilling formula, "We abandon you to the secular arm." Everyone knew what this meant. While the church itself could not shed blood, princes and city magistrates would do so in its stead. Yet what if the accused refused to confess? In time, church authorities, drawing on Roman legal concepts and newly codified canon law, sanctioned a tool that would become dreadfully common: torture. This was not done lightly. In theory, torture required multiple witnesses or serious circumstantial evidence, but as the inquisitorial system expanded, the thresholds often slipped. The rationale was stark. Better to save many souls by uncovering heretical networks than risk the contagion spreading, and so the practice grew. Picture the strappado, the prisoner's wrists bound behind their back, hoisted by a rope until shoulders threatened to wrench from sockets, then abruptly dropped, only to be jerked painfully short of the ground. Imagine the rack, a cruel frame on which limbs were slowly stretched until joints cracked, or the water torture, where cloth stuffed into a victim's mouth was drenched again and again, forcing them to gulp and choke, drowning not in a river, but in their own convulsions of fear. The chambers where these torments took place were often quiet, save for the harsh demands of the inquisitor and the muffled sobs of the accused. Sometimes there were priests nearby, urging the victim to confess and thus save their immortal soul, even as flesh gave way to the insistent will of those seeking truth. Confessions extracted in this manner were then carefully written down, forming part of a permanent record, one that might later be read aloud in solemn court before sentences were pronounced. And alongside this rising machinery of fear stood another phenomenon, still in its early shadow. Witchcraft, in these centuries, was not yet the great frenzy it would become in later times. Instead, it occupied a curious place on the edge of belief. Most church authorities in the 13th and early 14th centuries regarded stories of witches with skepticism. The idea that frail human beings could truly summon storms or fly through the night seemed, to many clerics, more an illusion planted by the devil than a literal power. Thus, charges of witchcraft often resulted in penances similar to those for other superstitions: fasting, pilgrimages, perhaps public humiliation. But seeds of dread were quietly being sown. Theologians debated the reality of witches' pacts with demons. Popular stories circulated of women who cursed livestock or spoiled ale. Village healers, midwives, or the peculiar old widow living at the edge of the woods found themselves objects of wary fascination. The boundary between harmless superstition and heresy was delicate, easily transgressed by rumour. And so it was that Europe, as it moved through the later Middle Ages, stood upon a precarious threshold. Torture had entered the courts. Inquisitions had woven networks of informants and confessions, and the faint but growing dread of witchcraft waited in the wings. The world seemed ever more vigilant, ever more suspicious, eager to peer into hearts and minds to root out not only crimes of hand, but also crimes of belief. The 14th century was a time of slow but steady escalation. Heresy was now widely understood not merely as an individual failing, but as a contagion that could weaken the very fabric of Christendom. And alongside it, the murmurs of witchcraft grew subtly darker. In many small towns, people still brought simple complaints: disputes over grazing lands, theft of chickens, insults exchanged in heated marketplaces. Yet increasingly, these petty quarrels found themselves entangled with deeper suspicions. Was it merely a coincidence that after an angry exchange, a farmer's cow dropped dead? that a child took ill with fevers after a midwife's visit. Under the growing influence of ecclesiastical teaching about the devil's cunning, ordinary misfortunes became suspect. In such an environment, inquisitors found fertile ground for expanding their inquiries. Manuals of interrogation and confession, such as Bernard Guy's influential texts, offered detailed frameworks for questioning suspects, carefully laying out how to guide, coax, or press confessions from reluctant mouths. Torture, once theoretically constrained, slipped ever more easily into routine. The legal rationale was chillingly straightforward. It was better for an innocent man to suffer in this life than for countless souls to be imperiled by the spread of heretical poison. These investigations were meticulous. Testimonies were recorded by scribes who dipped their quills into ink with measured calm, noting every faltering word of a terrified suspect. Lists of accomplices were demanded. Webs of suspicion grew wide and sticky, often ensnaring neighbours, relatives, even entire villages. Under such pressure, many would name others simply to halt their own agony. And after all was written and weighed, sentences were read out, sometimes within the echoing nave of a great cathedral, before a sea of tense faces. Those found guilty but willing to recant might still be spared the flames, their punishment instead a life of penance under the watchful eye of the church. But the unrepentant? They were handed to secular authorities, whose judges and executioners rarely hesitated. Even so, executions specifically for witchcraft remained relatively rare in this period. The Church was still cautious, its doctrine not yet fully hardened into the witch-hunting manuals that would come later. Witchcraft was, in many cases, seen as tragic delusion rather than demonic conspiracy. Yet the framework was taking shape. The belief that heretics or witches struck not merely at earthly order but at the divine order of God himself prepared hearts and minds for the harsher persecutions that would come. And meanwhile, outside the solemn stone walls of inquisitorial chambers, the ordinary world trudged on. Merchants set up stalls in muddy streets, hawking bolts of cloth or fragrant cheeses. Children laughed and splashed sticks in puddles. Monks travelled from village to village, collecting tithes or preaching on sin and redemption. Yet, always, just beneath this everyday bustle, ran a current of fear. The knowledge that the wrong word, the wrong friend, even a bit of bad luck could bring suspicion. And that suspicion could so easily blossom into ruin. Thus, by the close of the 14th century, Europe was already steeped in a culture of both public spectacle and private dread. The scaffold and the pillory stood ready for thieves and brawlers, but also increasingly for those whose only crime was a matter of belief or rumour. The inquisitorial courts had refined their processes into something coldly efficient, and torture was no longer an aberration but a sanctioned mechanism of divine inquiry. And all of this laid the groundwork for darker times ahead. As centuries turned, as new fears took root and old animosities sharpened, the stage would be set for persecutions more frenzied and flames that rose higher. But for now, Europe lingered in this uneasy interlude, caught between lingering medieval customs and the ominous dawn of more systematized, more ideological punishments. In the medieval period, above all other crimes, treason stood alone in its dread and spectacle. To murder a common man was to offend his family. To murder a priest was to affront the church. But to betray the king was to violate the very mystical body politic, a concept woven from strands of both theology and law. For medieval kingship was not simply a political office. It was an institution infused with divine sanction. The coronation, draped in holy oils and solemn oaths, was understood to bind the ruler to God, and the king's body became in some sense a living vessel for the kingdom itself. Thus, to conspire against the king, to question his rule, or even to imagine his death in secret councils, was to tear at the sacred fabric of society. And so the punishment for treason was intentionally designed to reflect this unparalleled offence. In England, the punishment developed into a ritual of compounded horrors. The condemned was first drawn, tied to a hurdle or wooden panel, and dragged by horse through the streets, a living announcement of disgrace. Then came the hanging, where the traitor's body danced on the rope, but not to its end. Before death could bring release, he would be cut down, still conscious, to face the surgeon's knife, his belly slit open, entrails pulled forth and burned before his eyes, a visceral sign of his betrayal of the king's innermost trust. Finally, his body would be quartered, limbs severed, the parts sent to distant towns to be displayed on gates and walls. Heads often crowned city bridges, impaled upon iron spikes, slowly blackening and shrivelling in sun and wind. The very scattering of his body across the realm mirrored the belief that his crime had threatened to shatter the unity of the kingdom. Yet there existed a grim courtesy for the nobility. A man of high birth, if found guilty of treason, might be spared these torments. Instead, he would kneel at the block, his neck offered to the axe. Even this was no quiet end. The severed head would often still meet a spike above the city gate, silent testimony to the fate of those who dared reach beyond their station. It was in this same age that justice began to slip from the fragmented hands of local lords and gather under the more unified authority of the crown. From the 13th century into the 15th, kings of England and France increasingly sought to centralise power, tightening their grasp on law and punishment. Royal justices travelled the countryside in circuits, known in England as the Ayers, hearing pleas that once might have been settled only by a local baron or manor court. They carried with them the authority of the king himself, and their records, written carefully on long rolls of parchment, began to form a body of precedent that shaped the future consistency of English common law. This slow movement toward a standardized legal system meant that punishments too became more predictable. No longer was justice wholly at the whim of a local lord whose tempers might turn with the seasons. Now, cases were judged against written expectations, scribes took down the details, and judgments could be compared across shires and decades. While this did not always ensure fairness, corruption and bias still flourished. It did lay the groundwork for a system where even the powerful might be called to account. Royal courts also introduced clearer distinctions between crimes. Theft, murder and assault were increasingly codified, with penalties corresponding to their severity and impact on the king's peace. Yet treason always loomed above these ordinary offences, its punishment uniquely savage, precisely because it struck at the royal heart. This age saw not only solitary traitors brought low, but grand conspiracies unravelling under the weight of intrigue and ambition. Plots among nobles, whether to overthrow a rival claimant or to weaken the king's hand, became the stuff of both chroniclers and executioners. When such schemes failed, the retribution was designed not simply to punish, but to make a spectacle so vivid that it would linger in the minds of any who might harbour similar dreams. In the public squares of London, Paris, and countless lesser cities, great wooden scaffolds rose, watched by seas of tense faces. Trumpets blared, heralds read proclamations. Then came the executioners, men practiced in their art, sharpening blades on whetstones before the crowd's eyes. Heads of conspirators were hoisted high on spikes above city gates or along the London Bridge, grinning grotesquely down at travellers. Their estates were seized by the crown, their families reduced in wealth and power, for treason was a stain that could ruin entire lineages. Property confiscation was as much a tool of royal strategy as was the axe. By stripping rebels of their lands and titles, kings not only enriched their own coffers, but also rebalanced the landscape of loyalty. Those who once feasted in great halls now found themselves beggars, while faithful subjects received grants of land carved from the traitors' holdings. These executions were carefully orchestrated theatres of warning. Every banner, every drum roll, every gruesome display of bodily remains served to etch into the collective memory the fate awaiting those who would dare to undermine the sovereign's rule. In this, the medieval concept of justice was starkly clear. Order must be preserved, whatever the cost in human blood and shattered families. And so, across the damp cobblestones and the timbered squares of medieval towns, these executions for political crimes became more than punishments. They were woven into the very social fabric, cautionary tales enacted in flesh and steel. Children perched on fathers' shoulders to see the heads of traitors displayed above the gates. Merchants paused their carts. Apprentices clustered together, all bearing silent witness to the brutal majesty of royal justice. This performance of punishment did more than quell conspiracies. It reaffirmed time and again the king's sacred position as guardian of the realm. Each bloody end was meant to echo down the years, a gruesome echo chamber reinforcing that the body of the king, and by extension the kingdom, was inviolate, demanding loyalty above all else. And thus, as the 15th century wore on, these scenes continued to play out with a grim regularity. Rebellions sparked and failed, claimants rose and fell, and the instruments of justice, scaffold, axe, iron spike, remained ever ready, each sharpened for the next chapter of betrayal. Through it all, the crowd's hushed awe and the lingering scent of blood reminded every witness that beneath the pomp and processions of medieval kingship lay a core truth. Power sustained itself not only through blessings and ceremonies, but through terror, public suffering, and the carefully choreographed ruin of those who dared to dream of the throne. In the late medieval age, between the 1400s and the turn of the 1500s, society clung to its old customs with fervour, even as fresh winds of thought began to rustle through cobbled courts and candlelit churches. Here, in this delicate twilight, justice still held the iron mask of fear, but new undercurrents stirred beneath. By this period, public executions had evolved into deeply ritualized events, almost carnivals in their own right. When word spread that a hanging or beheading was to be staged, entire villages and bustling towns would empty into the streets. Merchants wheeled in carts laden with roasted meats and sweetmeats. Ale flowed freely from barrels into rough wooden cups. Jugglers, musicians, and wandering mummers found rich custom as they danced and sang, their antics serving as grotesque prelude to the solemn spectacle to come. Children squealed, chasing each other beneath the creaking scaffolds. Lovers pressed close in the crowd, seeking the thrill of shared horror. For the authorities, this was not mere entertainment. The public execution was a carefully orchestrated reaffirmation of the social order, meant to display both the majesty of royal and divine justice and the dreadful cost of defiance. The condemned often processed through the streets with clergy chanting prayers, their confessions drawn out for all to hear, reinforcing the morality tale at the heart of the drama. Sometimes actors performed short moral plays beforehand, vignettes of good and evil, of Satan tempting sinners, so that as the noose tightened or the axe fell, the audience would see not just a human demise, but the cosmic balance being restored. The executioner, too, became part of this ritual theatre. Often masked or hooded, wielding a blade honed to sinister perfection, he stood as the dark hand of collective will. Afterward, crowds might surge forward to dip handkerchiefs in the blood of martyrs or traitors, believing them to hold curative or protective powers. So closely did notions of sacredness and violence intertwine. Underpinning these scenes was a worldview steeped in moral symbolism. Crime was rarely seen as a purely secular offence. To steal, to kill, to bear false witness. These were affronts not only to earthly law, but to God's great design. Sin and crime interwove seamlessly, a tapestry in which spiritual corruption led inevitably to social disruption. Communities thus carried a profound sense of collective responsibility. If a murderer or thief found shelter within a village and later was discovered, the entire settlement might be fined by royal agents. Sheriffs and bailiffs collected these amercements, making sure that local negligence paid a tangible price. The reasoning was simple. In a world governed by divine providence, to tolerate wrongdoing was to invite God's displeasure upon all. It was common for homilies and sermons to dwell on these themes. Preachers would stand in pulpits, their voices echoing off stone walls, warning that a single sinner might draw pestilence or famine upon the entire parish. The health of society, crops, children, even the weather, was believed tied to the moral health of its members. Thus justice, grim as it was, served a purpose larger than individual penalty. It restored the broken cosmic harmony. Amid these enduring beliefs, however, quiet transformations began reshaping how justice was actually administered. One of the most profound shifts lay in the slow abandonment of the ordeal. The ancient practice by which a person might prove innocence through divine intervention, be it by plunging a hand into boiling water or being cast into a cold river to see if God would let them sink or float. This change had been set in motion over a century earlier by the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. Since priests were required to bless the water or oversee the rituals, this ecclesiastical ban effectively dismantled the mechanism. Without the Church's cooperation, ordeals lost their legitimacy. In place of divine tests emerged the more human instrument of the jury trial. Gradually, local men, freeholders, merchants, sometimes minor nobles, were summoned to give witness or render verdicts. The process was still very far from our modern standards of impartial justice. Juries often relied on communal reputation, rumour, or local vendettas. Yet this represented a profound pivot from a system in which God's judgment was sought through miraculous signs to one where human reason, memory and testimony formed the crucible of truth. Courts began keeping more detailed written records. Cases that once might have been settled in manor halls through oath-swearing or ordeal now wound their way through formal proceedings, complete with clerks scratching away at long scrolls. Over time, this nurtured a subtle faith in collective human discernment, a fragile new trust that truth might be found not just by divine fiat, but by careful weighing of witness and evidence. And so, across these decades bridging the late Middle Ages, justice found itself caught between two great poles: the enduring vision of sin and divine wrath on one side, and on the other, the slow construction of a more secular, evidence-driven model of truth. It was not a clean break. Village priests still preached that crimes were punishments sent by God or the devil, and many villagers wholeheartedly agreed. Yet side by side with these homilies, juries gathered in timbered halls, scratching their heads over contradictory testimony. Sheriffs rode out under royal writs to summon witnesses, and scribes hunched over parchment, recording each stammered answer. The very walls of justice were being rebuilt stone by careful stone, even if the people who lived within them still half expected angels or demons to appear. This shift didn't soften the punishments themselves. Men and women found guilty might still lose a hand, an ear, or their very lives. But now there was at least a semblance of deliberation, an attempt at weighing facts, which marked a profound departure from plunging hands into cauldrons or trusting the fickle waters to reveal guilt. In its own tentative, stumbling way, Europe was inching toward the concept that truth lay not solely in heaven, but also in the mouths and memories of ordinary folk. And all the while, the crowds continued to gather. They thronged to see men hanged for theft, or women paraded with shaved heads for adultery, the streets thick with the smell of sweat, bread, and fear. The common people clung to these rituals, believing that through them, their world, fragile, disease-ridden, unpredictable, might be kept in balance a little longer. Justice, whether by God's mysterious will or by jury's rough reason, still wore a bloody face. Yet beneath that mask, the first human questions about procedure and fairness began to stir. Tiny seeds that would, in centuries to come, flower into revolutions of law and rights. Among the most common offences stalking the medieval countryside and narrow town streets was theft in its many forms: simple pilfering, burglary under cover of night, or the terrifying audacity of highway robbery, where masked men would leap from hedges to brandish knives at merchant wagons. The responses were unflinchingly physical. A first-time thief, if spared the noose, might have his hand amputated at the wrist. A brutal, bleeding lesson that made it plain to all who saw him that he had once reached for what was not his. Public squares would often host such amputations, with a block of wood stained dark from past punishments. In less severe cases, flogging was administered, sometimes with knotted cords or barbed whips that tore the flesh. Markets would fill with curious onlookers, children perched on barrels to see better as the whip cracked and backs split open under the strokes. Afterward, the culprit might be branded with a hot iron, an indelible mark burned into the skin of the cheek or forehead, an unmistakable sign to future employers or hosts that this was a man of proven dishonesty. For certain thefts, especially repeated offences or violent robberies along lonely roads, there was little patience. Hanging became the sure remedy, the condemned sometimes strung up from the very trees where they had once lain in wait, so that passers-by would remember vividly the wages of preying upon travellers. Exile also stood among the penalties. A convicted thief might be banished from his shire, forced to wander under threat of death if found again within its borders. Such banishment, in a world where local ties meant survival, was often a slower, colder death sentence. When blood was spilled, the old tribal instincts that once governed Germanic lands still stirred beneath feudal law. In earlier times, Wergild, the man price, had allowed a killer to pay restitution to the victim's kin, thereby averting endless cycles of vengeance. But by the late medieval period, such payments had waned, replaced by more direct assertions of royal or communal justice. Murder typically met the gallows for common folk. Public hangings drew immense crowds, for murder was not simply an affront to the victim, but an insult to the entire community's security and to the king's peace. A man might be made to confess on the scaffold, holding aloft a crucifix with trembling hands before the trap was sprung. For the nobility, whose lives were considered worthier by law and custom, beheading was the usual fate. The axe or sword delivered a swift, if not always clean, end. Sometimes, botched executions would horrify onlookers, blades that glanced off skulls, executioners forced to strike again and again, while crowds gasped or retched. But for all its horror, beheading remained a punishment viewed as more honourable, reserved for those of elevated blood. Meanwhile, violent assaults that fell short of murder, grievous beatings, maimings, could result in heavy fines, corporal punishments like mutilation of ears or noses, or imprisonment in the dark, stinking confines of a local keep. The aim was always twofold: to satisfy divine justice and to deter any who might think to settle disputes by blade or bludgeon. Perhaps no crimes stirred deeper tremors of fear and fascination than those which struck at the spiritual order: blasphemy against God, heretical beliefs that threatened the unity of Christendom, or the whispered spells of sorcery. For blasphemy, public curses against Christ or the saints, mocking the sacraments. Punishments might start with fines, or humiliations, such as being paraded through the streets wearing donkey's ears or chained to church doors. But repeat offences could darken swiftly to harsher fates. Heresy and sorcery, especially as ecclesiastical fervour intensified, were viewed as infections of the body politic, requiring purification by fire. Though relatively rare at first, by the 14th and 15th centuries, burning at the stake became increasingly common. A stake would be driven into the ground, dry wood piled high, and the condemned, often barefoot, clad in a coarse shift, tied with ropes or iron chains. Prayers were murmured, sometimes offering a last chance for recantation. Then torches would be thrust into the kindling. The flames, crackling and snapping, were believed to purge not only the flesh but the soul, sending it cleansed or judged before God. Spectators came in droves. Vendors sold ale and pies as they might at a fair. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders to watch as smoke wreathed upward. The terror of fire was meant to etch a lesson deep into every heart. To defy the church was to imperil both life and afterlife. But if theft, murder, or even heresy could chill the medieval soul, nothing provoked quite the same awe or dread as treason. This was not simply a crime against another mortal or even against the church. It was viewed as a direct assault upon the sacred body of the king, who ruled by divine right. Thus, to betray one's sovereign was to spit upon the very order God had laid upon earth. Because of this, punishments for treason were carefully staged rituals of horror, calculated to make the gravest possible impression upon all who witnessed or later heard tell of them. In England, the fate reserved for a traitor of humble birth was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a process so ghastly it almost defies belief, yet was recorded time and again with grim precision. The condemned would be drawn to the place of execution on a hurdle or sledge, dragged through muddy streets behind a horse, jeered by crowds, their body already bruised and filthy by the time they arrived at the scaffold. There he would be hanged by the neck, but carefully cut down while still alive. What followed was even darker. The traitor was disemboweled, his entrails torn from his belly and burned before his wide, horrified eyes. Castration was also common, a symbolic unmaking of lineage and legacy. Only then would the executioner finally deliver death, often by beheading. The body was quartered, cut into 4 distinct parts, and these gruesome trophies were dispatched to various corners of the realm, nailed above gates or set on pikes to rot as warnings to all. For nobles, whose status spared them some of this drawn-out spectacle, decapitation by axe or sword was typically employed. Yet even here, ritual humiliation persisted. Heads were mounted on tall spikes atop city walls or London Bridge, so that travellers coming by river might see the rows of grim faces staring out across the water, hair blowing in the wind, mouths slack in silent caution. Property confiscation was another potent tool of royal punishment. To be found guilty of treason often meant not just the death of the body, but the ruination of one's entire family. Lands seized, castles emptied, wives and children cast upon uncertain charity. The king's justice reached far beyond the grave. It was, in many respects, a calculated theatre of cruelty. Monarchs and their ministers understood well that the fate of one traitor could secure the loyalty of thousands, and so townspeople gathered in uneasy fascination, whispering prayers, clutching their children close, all the while grateful it was not their own house bearing the shadow of suspicion. Thus did the catalogue of medieval punishments unfold, each tailored with a kind of grim artistry to the nature of the crime. Theft marked by lost hands and scorched skin, murder expiated by gallows or sword, heresy by cleansing flames, and treason by a carefully choreographed descent into mutilation and oblivion. Yet beneath all this, there also pulsed a growing restlessness, the faint beat of an emerging idea that justice might, in time, be served without such extravagant displays of agony. For now, though, the medieval world remained bound to its rituals of blood and fire, striving in its own dark way to keep the fragile order of man and God intact. Contrary to what many modern minds imagine, prisons in the Middle Ages were rarely meant for long-term punishment. They were holding chambers, dark antechambers to judgment, where men and women lingered until trial, ransom, confession, or execution. These prisons took many forms. Some were simple towers or undercrofts in a castle, their walls slick with damp air, thick with the tang of mould and rot. Others were purpose-built dungeons beneath city halls or cathedrals, narrow stone rooms with barely a sliver of light piercing through barred slits high above. Straw matted with lice and old blood often served as bedding. The stench was overwhelming, for sanitation was primitive at best. Buckets, if provided at all, overflowed with human waste. Disease flourished in these cramped quarters. Fleas and rats made their silent circuits, carrying plague and fever from prisoner to prisoner. Indeed, many never lived to hear their sentence. Infection and starvation performed a quieter execution long before the headsman could raise his axe. Yet even as they were grim, these places were not necessarily scenes of constant cruelty by design. They were simply neglected, chaotic spaces where the poor languished the longest, unable to afford the bribes or fees that might secure a swifter judgment or a cleaner cell. Justice, like so much else in medieval life, could be heavily oiled by silver. In the bright, bustling squares where townspeople went about their daily business, Prominently near marketplaces or the doors of churches stood the pillories and stocks, silent sentinels awaiting the next offender. The pillory was a wooden framework set upon a post with hinged holes to lock the head and hands. The criminal's neck was pressed forward, exposed to sun, rain, or winter wind. The stocks, by contrast, usually secured the feet, sometimes with a seat behind, forcing the culprit to sit awkwardly, legs extended through holes in a stout plank. These were not instruments of pain so much as of public humiliation and communal correction. Markets thrived on gossip, and here gossip was given a stage. Villagers jeered, laughed, and often took matters a step further, pelting the unfortunate with rotten eggs, turnips, or dung. Children squealed with delight as they aimed their missiles. Old women might mutter curses or prayers, depending on the nature of the crime. A merchant convicted of cheating with false weights, a servant who had stolen bread, a scold whose tongue wagged too freely, all might find themselves enduring hours under the scorn of their neighbours. This social theatre reinforced bonds of community by pointing out vividly what happened to those who broke its unwritten rules. But should we wander just beyond the city gates, perhaps climbing a gentle hill or following a cart's rutted path, we would come upon another, starker symbol of justice, the gallows. Many towns maintained a permanent set of gallows, timber frames darkened by rain and the drips of countless bodies. These were deliberately placed where travellers could see them, by crossroads, near bridges, or atop rises that commanded the approaches to town. The sight of a corpse twisting in the breeze, clothes tattered by wind and birds alike, was a silent proclamation that law ruled here, and woe to any who thought otherwise. Execution days themselves became communal gatherings. Vendors hawked pies and ale. Children ran about clutching pastries. A kind of rough festival spirit took hold. Yet as the hour approached, the crowd grew hushed. Heads craned for a better view, hands clutched scapulars or wooden crosses, murmured prayers escaping pale lips. Watching a man die was a stark lesson in mortality and the power of kings and courts, and often the bodies were left dangling for days or weeks until crows and weather reduced them to little more than bone and rag. The people believed that seeing such grim relics deterred others from following the same dark path. Of course, not all punishments took place so openly beneath the sun. Some were hidden behind heavy wooden doors, in cold stone chambers lit only by sputtering torches. Here stood the instruments of torture, each designed not simply to inflict agony, but to break the will, to draw forth confessions, true or otherwise. The rack, perhaps the most infamous of these devices, was a sturdy wooden frame fitted with rollers and ropes. The prisoners' wrists and ankles were tied at opposite ends, and with each turn of the rollers their body stretched further. Tendons strained, joints popped, and screams filled the vaulted rooms. Smaller, more intimate tools also abounded. Thumb screws crushed the delicate bones of the fingers. The iron boot or brodequin encased the leg. Then wedges were hammered between the iron and flesh, sending splinters of agony through shin and calf. There were strappados, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted aloft, then abruptly dropped to wrench shoulders from their sockets. Water torture, too, made its mark. Victims might have cloth forced into their mouths. Water poured relentlessly until they felt themselves drowning again and again. A terrifying dance with death that often ended in shattered minds rather than broken bodies. And always there was the psychological terror. Dark cells, the threat of further pain, the cries of others echoing down damp corridors. Sometimes these alone sufficed to loosen tongues. To truly understand why they punished as they did, we must dwell for a moment inside the medieval mind. This was a world where faith and life were utterly interwoven, where each act, large or small, was believed to reverberate not just in the earthly realm but also across the divine tapestry woven by God. Crime, then, was not simply a breach of human law. It was a wound to the cosmic order, a tear in the carefully balanced harmony established by God. To steal, to murder, to commit adultery or blasphemy, each was seen as more than an offence against another person or even the king. It was an insult to the Almighty himself. Thus, justice in these centuries sought above all to restore that sacred balance. Punishment, severe and uncompromising, was viewed as a necessary medicine. The pain inflicted on the body was thought to purify the soul, sparing the criminal an even harsher fate in the life to come. Better to burn for a moment on earth than for eternity in hellfire. Suffering here was not merely tolerated, it was, in some ways, believed redemptive. To bear punishment meekly was seen as a sign of repentance. Many chroniclers recorded with approval how condemned men kissed the executioner's hand or mounted the scaffold with prayers on their lips, hoping that through this earthly ordeal they might escape divine wrath beyond the grave. Hand in hand with these spiritual notions was the very practical belief in deterrence through spectacle. If punishment cleansed the wrongdoer, it also served to warn the onlookers. It is why executions were so often carried out in broad daylight before crowds, why thieves were flogged at market time, why heretics burned outside city gates where pilgrims passed. Each punishment was a kind of theatre of moral instruction, its script written in blood and fear. The medieval authorities, whether king, sheriff, or bishop, counted on this. They believed that the vivid memory of a neighbour dangling lifeless from the gallows, or of a woman screaming amid flames, would implant a deep and quivering caution in every heart. Justice was made visible and unforgettable. It was a sermon far more powerful than words alone, and this spectacle was not solely for earthly order. Watching punishment was also deemed a communal spiritual exercise. It reminded all present of the wages of sin, of the fragile line between innocence and damnation. Observers might pray for the soul of the condemned even as they recoiled from his crimes, binding the community together in a shared meditation on mortality and divine judgment. We must remember that in these centuries there was no firm boundary between the secular and the sacred. Kings ruled by the grace of God, priests blessed the swords of executioners, law itself was thought to emanate from the divine order. Thus, punishment was not merely the vengeance of a sovereign or a town council, it was carried out as an instrument of God's own justice, executed through human hands. To defy the law was to defy the will of heaven. This is why so many punishments, even for worldly crimes, began or ended with prayers, confessions, and last rites. The condemned were almost always given a final chance to reconcile with God. Priests attended executions, hearing confessions at the foot of the scaffold or even on the gallows steps. The hope, both for the dying man and for the crowd, was that repentance in the last hour might open the gates of paradise, transforming the grisly scene into a sort of tragic grace. And so, each punishment was layered, a brutal, practical necessity to deter crime, a spiritual ritual to cleanse the sinner, and a profound drama to remind the living of the stakes of every moral choice. We drift now into the faint grey dawn of the 16th century, an age still shadowed by the Middle Ages, yet touched by the first cool breath of change. Here we find medieval justice slowly, almost reluctantly, beginning to soften its edges. For centuries, torture had been a sanctioned instrument of truth, the twisting of limbs and the cracking of joints seen as a dark key to unlock secrets and confessions. But by the early 1500s, subtle tremors were shaking this old certainty. The ideas of the Renaissance humanists, who looked back to the classical world with fresh, critical eyes, began to stir doubts. Was it right, they asked, to rely on agony to find truth? Could confession wrung from a man screaming on the rack be trusted at all? Such critiques started to trickle into learned discourse. Erasmus of Rotterdam and other gentle voices questioned cruelty as a tool of governance. Even certain jurists, wary of the sheer unreliability of torture-induced confessions, urged caution. Meanwhile, the printing press, still a wondrous novelty, scattered these thoughts farther and wider than any monk's painstakingly copied manuscript ever could. Pamphlets and treatises that once would have lain hidden in cloisters now landed on merchant tables and lawyers' benches, whispering new ideas into new ears. These were small stirrings, of course. In many places, torture would continue for another century or more, yet it was clear the old, unchallenged certainties had begun to erode, and the tide, though still slow, was inching toward restraint. Alongside these philosophical misgivings grew practical shifts in the machinery of justice itself. The gradual disappearance of trials by ordeal and by combat, already underway since the 13th century, had left a space that something more measured needed to fill. Thus, the jury system, once an informal gathering of local men swearing to common knowledge, evolved toward something closer to how we might recognize it today. No longer merely testifying to rumor or communal gossip, jurors were increasingly expected to weigh actual evidence and witness testimony. Royal courts, especially in England, were at the forefront of this transformation. They sought to professionalize proceedings, to keep records of judgments, to standardize not just punishments but procedures. Here we glimpse the earliest seeds of what would later blossom into concepts like due process, though still a fragile, uneven thing at this time. Yet for all this progress, the process was far from perfect. Accused men might still languish in foul prisons for months before trial. Bribery and intimidation could bend juries, and torture still lurked, especially on the continent, sanctioned by inquisitors or by secular judges desperate to close a case. But even so, something vital had begun to stir in the collective mind, the idea that guilt should be demonstrated by proof and not merely assumed through ordeal, rumor, or the forced shriek of a tortured confession. So we find ourselves walking along the threshold where the medieval gives way to the modern, though often only reluctantly. Many of the old horrors still clung to life. The burning of heretics and witches, in fact, surged again in this period, ironically just as torture and trial by ordeal were waning. The fears of heresy and witchcraft took on a sharper edge, no longer merely quaint superstitions or ecclesiastical worries, but dangerous conspiracies against both church and crown. Across parts of Germany, France, Scotland, and beyond, communities kindled pyres to purge what they believed were nests of satanic corruption. Some of these burnings, especially those tied to local panics, had more in common with medieval passions than emerging modern rationalism. Meanwhile, executions for theft, murder, or treason continued to draw throngs. The spectacle had not disappeared, though perhaps its meaning was shifting. Public hangings, beheadings, and brandings still served to warn, but the undercurrent was increasingly one of state control, less explicitly tied to God's cosmic order than to the sovereign's earthly law. Across this century, we witness a curious twilight. The ancient rituals of punishment, the chanting priests at the scaffold, the heads on spikes, the racks in damp chambers, still held sway, yet around them sprouted fragile new ideas, that evidence might matter more than terror, that confessions ought to be freely given, that justice might someday serve not only God and King, but also the rights of the accused. Beneath all the laws and rituals, the sermons and sentences, there was always something more restless, something harder to tame, the human impulse to flee. Not every accused knelt before the block, not every thief awaited the stocks. Some turned their backs on the system entirely, and ran. So, as the fires of the Middle Ages continued to burn, another story began to smoulder just at the edge of the law, the story of outlaws and bandits, those who slipped through the grasp of medieval justice and carved out lives of danger, desperation, and, in some cases, strange legend. In the next part of our journey, we will turn our gaze to the forests and moors, the wild roads and mountain passes where men and women lived beyond the law's reach. We'll explore who they were, highwaymen, deserters, rebels, folk heroes, and what became of those who risked everything to escape the grip of justice. Were they villains? Were they survivors, or were they symbols of resistance? Their world was one of risk, hunger, and pursuit, but also freedom. Raw, uncertain, and fleeting, so stay close. Our next story waits just beyond the gallows. It is a grey morning in the heartlands of England. The fog hangs low over the fields, drifting lazily across small clusters of wooden huts, their thatched roofs beaded with dew. A cock crows somewhere beyond the mist, greeting another day that for many will be much like the last. A day bent under the weight of obligation, of toil, and of fear. This is the medieval world, in the turning years of the 11th century, a landscape not yet fully claimed by the crown, where power is as fractured and raw as the soil itself. The people here are bound by invisible chains, the ties of fealty, of rent, of birth. A serf awakens on his straw pallet, stretching his aching shoulders before trudging out to the narrow strips of farmland allotted to his village by the local lord. His life, and that of his children, is pledged to this soil, pledged to taxes, to levies, to the whispered demands of the man who lives in a stone hall upon the hill, surrounded by guards and banners. For these were the days when the feudal system reigned supreme, each manor a small kingdom, each lord a petty sovereign with the right to judge, to imprison, sometimes even to execute. Above them all, the king, distant, occasionally benevolent, often ruthless, a figure crowned by God but whose grip on his barons was far from absolute. Justice, too, was scattered across these shifting lines of loyalty. There was no single set of laws that stretched like a neat tapestry across the realm. Instead, customs varied from shire to shire, enforced by sheriffs whose loyalties might bend with coin or kin. Disputes were settled in local courts, the 100 courts, the manorial courts, each guided by tradition, by ancient precedent, and by the Lord's will. And what if you broke these fragile codes? What if you stole a sheep, struck down a rival, or failed to pay a debt owed to your master? The punishments could be harsh, but perhaps none so chilling as being declared an outlaw, literally placed outside the law, beyond its protections. To be outlawed meant you were no longer under the king's peace. Anyone might strike you down without consequence, seize your lands, refuse you shelter. You became as much a ghost as a man, surviving by wit and steel, shunned by hearth and chapel alike. And yet, from this dark sentence, stories began to grow. Stories of men who, once stripped of all protection, did not merely fade into the forest, but took up arms, carved their own path, and sometimes, just sometimes, found a way back into the fold of respectability. It is here, amid this tense balance of fealty and fracture, that we first hear of a name, Fulk Fitzwarren. Fulk was no ragged peasant skulking through the bracken. He was born into privilege, into a family of marcher lords who guarded, and often raided, the shifting, bloody frontier between England and Wales. His lineage was Norman, steeped in the rough justice of conquest, his hall adorned with shields that bore lions rampant and crosses patents. Yet even such noble birth did not secure peace in an age where property and power were won by sword as much as by grant. The Fitzwarrens had long held Whittington Castle, a stout fortress of grey stone crouched on the borderlands. When King John came to the throne, that same John who would soon be remembered for losing Normandy, for provoking the Magna Carta, he took Whittington from the Fitzwarrens under some thin pretext of royal right and bestowed it upon another. Betrayed by the very king whose peace he was sworn to uphold, Fulk rebelled. At first it was a formal grievance, a plea through the tangled channels of feudal petition, but John, ever suspicious and grasping, rebuffed him, and so the Marcher Lord did what so many would do when the crown failed them. He gathered his kin, his sworn men, and took to the woods. Thus began a new chapter in Fulk's life, one woven from ambush and flight, from sudden raids upon convoys laden with royal taxes, from clandestine meetings in mossy clearings. The chronicles tell of a time when Fulk and his band shadowed the very highways that ran between Shrewsbury and Chester, striking at messengers, harrying the king's sheriffs, reclaiming through violence what they believed was denied them by right. And yet, the story of Fulk Fitzwarren does not end in a hangman's noose or an ignoble death upon the forest floor. For even as he was hunted, even as proclamations went out declaring him an outlaw, with rewards promised for his capture, the tides of fortune shifted. King John, beleaguered by other baronial revolts and foreign threats, found it more prudent to reconcile than to continue the feud. In time, Fulk was pardoned, his lands restored, his loyalty renewed under a royal charter. From bandit to baron once more, his tale was immortalized in the romance of Fulk Fitzwarren, a medieval narrative that mingled fact and legend, depicting him almost as a knight-errant, striving for justice against a tyrant king. Thus we see how, even in these earliest years of the 12th century, the seeds were sown for a curious paradox that one could be both a breaker of laws and a champion of rightful order, that outlawry itself might become a strange crucible in which loyalty was reforged. Across the marshes of Shropshire, peasants would whisper of Fulk's deeds, some with fear, some with admiration, and deep in the dark halls of other lords, men watched, weighing how easily fortune could turn, how a nobleman might, in a heartbeat, pass from the king's favour into shadow, then with equal suddenness be summoned back into the royal fold. As Fulk Fitzwarren rode again beneath the banners of royal pardon, the roads he once stalked did not soon forget the thunder of hooves nor the scent of burning that his rebellion had left behind. And through this tale, whispered from hearth to hearth, embroidered by minstrels who sought silver pennies at fairs and markets, there began to form an idea both dangerous and oddly alluring, that to stand outside the law might, under certain circumstances, be not a mark of disgrace, but a badge of rugged honour. For these were still days when the very concept of law was deeply personal. It sprang not from an abstract sense of statehood, but from the body and will of the king, from oaths of loyalty sworn upon relics of saints, from the fine balances of tribute and protection. To be outlawed meant your name was read aloud in the county court, declared 3 times, and if you did not appear, if you could not or dared not stand before the king's justices, you were then waived. For men, this was to be outlaw. For women, to be waived, set aside by law's mercy. It was not a swift descent. Notices would go out, the hue and cry raised. Neighbours might be compelled to help hunt you, lest they too fall under suspicion. Only then, when all avenues closed, did you vanish into the margins, surviving by the fragile grace of hidden kin or sympathetic strangers. Many who fled justice in these centuries were not noblemen with castles to regain, but humble folk, peasants who struck a bailiff in a tavern brawl, who stole a pig to feed hungry children. For them, there was seldom any hope of royal reconciliation. They moved through a landscape of moss and mist, sleeping in hollow oaks, creeping from village to village beneath moonlight to beg a crust or steal a hen. Local priests might be torn. To shelter such a soul was to risk fine or worse, yet to deny a man bread was a cruelty no scripture easily condoned. Thus outlawry wove itself into the moral fabric of these times, a haunting presence that hovered at the edge of every community, a silent cautionary tale against wrath and poverty alike. We might best understand outlawry by likening it to a secular form of excommunication, just as a sinner might be barred from Mass and denied burial in hallowed ground. So too did the outlaw live outside the peace of the realm. He could not plead in court, could not marry lawfully, could not even be avenged if murdered. In these iron-bound years of faith, to exist cut off from the communal rights of the Church was terror enough, but to be equally cut off from the protections of the king's law was to drift perilously close to the realm of the wolf, the bear, the raven that feasted upon unclaimed corpses after battle. And so, at every village green the people understood, it was better to bow one's head, to pay the rents and taxes, to nod respectfully when the reeve or sheriff passed by, than to tempt the abyss of outlawry. Yet even so, ballads would later emerge that painted such men in brighter colours. For in the stories told by travelling jongleurs and sung in smoky halls by weary soldiers, the outlaw became something more than a hunted beast. He became a figure of rough justice, of bold defiance against cruel lords or unjust kings. Long after Fulk Fitzwarren was dead, his deeds lived on in manuscripts that danced the line between history and romance, the romance of Fulk. Fitzwarren, written in Anglo-Norman prose likely around the early 13th century, cast him not only as a dispossessed baron but as a cunning hero, a man who donned disguises, who fought giants and Saracens, who rescued maidens from dark towers. These embellishments served a deeper hunger in the medieval heart, a need to believe that courage and loyalty might yet triumph over tyranny, that a man wronged could reclaim his honour by his own hand. Such stories crept across the land like ivy, entwining themselves with local tales of lesser outlaws. Even small acts of defiance might be dressed up in the trappings of legend. A farmer who defied a harsh steward, a fugitive who robbed a corrupt toll collector. These could, in the telling, be woven into the grand tapestry of noble outlawry. And from these earliest seeds, from Fulk's bitter feud with King John, from the harsh legal machinery of outlawry, from the desperate hopes of peasants who prayed for some champion to strike down injustice, there grew the broader cult of the outlaw that would flourish in the centuries to come. To walk the medieval roads of England in these days was to traverse a living map of fear and memory. Certain groves were avoided after dusk, said to harbour those who had been put to the horn, proclaimed outlaw by the blowing of a hunting horn in court. Travellers spoke of lonely fords where ambushes were common, or of crossroads marked by crude wooden gibbets creaking in the wind beneath dark burdens, grim reminders of those who failed to outrun both law and vengeance. Such sights were not merely warnings, they were chapters in an unspoken story shared by all who lived under the fragile canopy of the king's peace. In small hamlets where people scratched a living from thin soil, the threat of outlawry was a constant shadow. A man might be driven to crime by hunger or drawn into feud by loyalty to kin. Once named an outlaw, he could no longer tend his fields. His family might struggle on, but neighbours, fearing fines for harbouring a fugitive, would keep a wary distance. And so many outlaws found themselves drawn to the margins of society quite literally, to the greenwoods, to the heathlands, to the bracken-choked valleys where the king's writ ran thin. There, in rude camps or half-ruined hunting lodges, bands formed out of necessity and shared peril. Some were little more than starving men with knives, but others, like the retinues that once followed Fulk Fitzwarren, operated with alarming organisation. They forged secret alliances with discontented tenants, bribed gatekeepers, or sent letters sealed with threats and promises alike. And across these tangled networks of loyalty and fear, the legend of the outlaw continued to grow, sometimes even embraced by local folk who saw in them a rough justice when official courts proved too remote or too cruel. In this way, what began with individual stories, a baron denied his rightful inheritance, a peasant who lashed out in desperate rage, slowly wove itself into a larger social pattern. The crown's power, still patchy and often contested, could not always suppress these local loyalties, or break the myth that an outlaw might still be a true man, wronged more by the harshness of his overlord than by any sin of his own. In the Welsh marches, where families like the Fitzwarrens had long balanced allegiance to the king with their own borderland ambitions, outlawry sometimes blurred into outright private war. Meanwhile, in the heart of England, minor nobles who lost favour might vanish for a season into the forests, re-emerging when political tides shifted, their past transgressions quietly forgiven in the name of renewed loyalty. Thus the concept of outlawry was not simply a punishment but a crucible, a trial by wilderness, by hunger and steel and fear. Those who survived it might return hardened, bearing scars both visible and hidden, their reputations altered forever. For some, this was the end of their tale, their names consigned to dusty rolls of outlawry still kept in ancient archives. Lists of men whose homes were forfeited, whose goods were seized, whose families faded into obscurity. But for others, like Fulk Fitzwarren, it was the start of something more complex, a legend that would ripple through the centuries, shaping the way generations thought about justice, loyalty, and the fragile dance between subject and sovereign. As the 12th century wore on into its waning decades, the landscape itself began to change. New castles rose, studded across the countryside like clenched fists of stone, projecting royal authority deeper into every shire. Sheriffs grew more assertive, circuit judges rode with growing confidence under the king's banners, and written records, rolls and charters and indictments spread like a net across the realm, catching ever smaller fish. The days when a noble could easily take to the greenwood and return at leisure were drawing to a close. But the ideas seeded by men like Fulk, did not vanish. Instead, they settled into the cultural soil, waiting to blossom in new forms. By the time the century turned, carrying Europe into the early 1200s, the stories of outlaws had begun to take on a curious dual life. In the hard light of official record, they were criminals, men whose goods were forfeit, whose names were grimly inscribed in county court rolls, whose families might suffer dispossession. Yet in the softer glow of hearth fires, in the verses of minstrels and the gossip of marketplaces, they were something more. Symbols of resistance against overreaching lords, avatars of personal honour reclaimed by force when no other recourse remained. These conflicting views laid the groundwork for an enduring paradox that would only deepen in the years to come. A tension between the outlaw as villain and the outlaw as folk hero, both feared and quietly admired. If we wander eastward across the cold rolling plains and dense forests of the Holy Roman Empire, the shadow of outlawry takes on a new, more armoured form. Here, in the fractured heart of medieval Europe, the 12th and 13th centuries bore witness to a peculiar breed of bandit, the Raubritter, the robber knight. Unlike the humble poachers and fugitive serfs who haunted England's greenwoods, these were men of high birth, clad in mail and bearing the proud crests of ancient families. They held castles not by the king's grant alone, but often by old right or by sheer force, and from these stone lairs they descended upon the merchants and peasants of the land like hawks upon unwary mice. The roots of this lawlessness ran deep into the tangled soil of imperial politics. For the Holy Roman Empire in these centuries was a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and baronial holdings, all bound loosely under an emperor whose authority might wax grand in ceremony, yet wane perilously in practice. And then, with the death of Emperor Frederick II in 1250, came the long night known as the Interregnum, nearly 2 generations wherein no crowned monarch wielded true, unchallenged power across these lands. Without a strong hand to enforce imperial law, scores were settled by sword and torch rather than writ and seal. Trade still pulsed through this landscape, lifeblood flowing along the broad arteries of the Rhine, the Main, the Danube. But where the law faltered, greed took swift root. Petty nobles set up unauthorized toll stations along these rivers, demanding coin from passing barges under threat of seizure or violence. Some even stretched iron chains across entire channels, forcing ships to halt midstream where archers waited upon the banks. It was a cruel parody of legitimate custom, for tolls were an accepted means of financing roads and bridges, but here they were exacted many times over by lords who gave nothing in return but fear. Villagers too were not spared. Mounted bands would thunder down from their keeps to seize livestock, burn granaries, and carry off hostages for ransom. Chronicles of the time record peasants arriving at market bearing only sorrow and half-empty carts, having paid with chickens, goats, or their daughters' dowries simply to ensure safe passage through a robber baron's domain. Yet even in these bleak chapters there flickered the stubborn light of communal resistance. By the mid-13th century, the great merchant cities along the Rhine had grown weary of perpetual extortion. Their guilds and councils banded together in a bold experiment, the Rheinische Städtebund, or Rhine League. These city-states pooled their militias, raised taxes for common defence, and agreed to strike directly at the fortresses of the Raubritter. In a series of coordinated campaigns, they besieged and dismantled many of these bandit castles, stone by stone, a deliberate erasure of criminal power that reshaped the political landscape of Central Europe. Imagine merchant caravans riding out under banners, not of distant emperors, but of united cities, flanked by hired crossbowmen who kept wary watch on every wooded rise. The Rhine-League's determination stood as a quiet revolution of its own, towns asserting that their commerce, their crafts, their fragile prosperity would no longer be at the mercy of arrogant knights with empty coffers and restless swords. Of course, such victories did not end the practice forever. Robber barons adapted, some seeking to cloak their extortion in elaborate charters, others retreating deeper into remote highland strongholds. But the alliances forged among these cities laid vital groundwork for the rise of more modern civic governance. They demonstrated that even in an age ruled by feudal loyalties, merchants and artisans could bend the arc of power toward their own protection, challenging the old notion that only hereditary lords could levy tolls or command armed men. And still, as the 13th century lengthened and gave way to the 14th, new forces of violence emerged, not bound by local titles or family crests, but by the raw economics of war. For Europe in these decades was a continent locked in cycles of conflict. The 100 Years' War between England and France flared and dimmed like a sputtering torch, but always left behind men accustomed to the trade of killing. When truces were signed or campaigns concluded, thousands of hardened soldiers found themselves suddenly idle, their pockets empty, their skills useful for little but plunder. Thus were born the Grandes Compagnies, the great companies of France. Loose confederations of disbanded mercenaries who turned their talents for siege and raid upon the very countryside they once swore to defend. Led by ruthless captains such as Seguin de Badafol, they extorted entire regions, demanding tribute in exchange for the promise not to burn crops or sack monasteries. In these mercenaries, historians see perhaps the first sustained model of professional criminal bands born directly from the machinery of national war. Unlike the Raubritter, whose power rested in ancestral halls and feudal dues, these soldiers for hire operated with startling mobility. They moved from duchy to duchy, offering their swords to the highest bidder. And when no prince paid, they simply paid themselves by taking what they wanted. Some even negotiated protection contracts, agreeing to spare villages for an agreed sum, a dark echo of the very feudal protections that knights once pledged in earnest. It is tempting to see these great companies as little more than wolves. Marauders without loyalty, without scruple, feeding on the misfortunes of rural France. Yet, to listen to some among them, they were simply men doing what war had taught them best. In rare surviving letters and accounts, we glimpse their mindset, soldiers who felt abandoned by kings who delayed wages, who broke solemn promises of land or bounty. Bereft of patronage, they turned necessity into ruthless enterprise. For them, plunder was merely deferred pay, ransom the rightful fruits of past campaigns. Thus, an unsettling logic held sway across the countryside. A mercenary company that burned fields and extorted abbeys one month might be hired by that same abbey the next, tasked to guard its relics against rival bands. And so it went, a dance of coin and blood and fragile contracts where loyalty was measured not by oaths sworn on relics, but by the weight of silver piled on a captain's table. The impact on ordinary folk was profound. Peasants learned to hide their stores in secret pits beneath barns, to bury parish treasures under the cold earth of churchyards. Women carried their jewellery sewn into bodices, Children were taught silence at the approach of horsemen. Markets shrank, trade faltered, and whole hamlets vanished from tax rolls, abandoned to wilderness as families fled deeper into forests to escape these war-bred predators. Yet paradoxically, this age of roaming mercenary bands also strengthened communal ties in places that endured. Villages pooled resources to pay protection levies or built stout wooden palisades around humble churches. They elected local watches, men who by day drove ploughs but by night kept wary vigil atop earthen ramparts, ready to sound horns at the first torchlit approach. In gentle book-lined rooms centuries later, historians would debate the legacy of these great companies. Some would argue they were the first modern warlords, not feudal lords bound by hereditary duty, nor mere rabble, but disciplined contingents operating like mobile corporations of crime. Led by figures such as Seguin de Bedefol, they negotiated, contracted, threatened, and occasionally even honoured agreements with the same formality once reserved for treaties between kings. A few scholars would go further, tracing lines of influence from these mercenary companies to later free companies and even to the condottieri of Italy. Professional soldiers whose loyalties were ever governed by gold, their allegiance as fluid as the river that carried merchant barges past crumbling toll towers. What remained after these years of ceaseless movement, of sudden raids and solemn payoffs? Scorched fields that took generations to heal. Merchant families who changed their trade routes forever, steering wide of regions known to harbour these ruthless bands. A quiet, gnawing caution that settled into the bones of medieval society. A sense that the next column of armed men passing along the road might bear the king's banner, or might simply wear it as disguise while hunting easier prey. In taverns and manor halls alike, tales of robber knights and mercenary tyrants mingled with older stories of forest outlaws. They were spoken of in the same breath, men who lived by force, whether clad in a lord's heraldic surcoat or a plain leather jerkin. The line between sanctioned war and criminal violence blurred so often that many no longer bothered to distinguish it. Yet even this grim landscape was not without its quiet corrections. As local rulers saw the ruin these companies left behind, they began to invest in more permanent forces, standing household guards, town militias bound by charters, new taxes meant specifically to maintain roads free of illegal tolls. In this way, ironically, the chaos sown by mercenary outlaws helped drive Europe toward more centralized, better regulated models of policing. In France, royal ordinances multiplied, granting sheriffs and bailies expanded powers to pursue bands of discharged soldiers who turned to brigandage. In the Holy Roman Empire, the cities that once smashed the Raubritter keeps evolved into powerful urban leagues, writing their own compacts for mutual defence, setting precedents that would echo into the age of guilds and beyond. Still, the scars ran deep. The haunted glades where villagers remembered hiding from mercenaries became places of whispered dread. Old keeps that once housed robber barons stood in ruin, but their legends lived on, embroidered by local bards into cautionary ballads sung by candlelight. And merchants, even generations later, would pause before crossing certain lonely stretches of road, as if half expecting the glint of spearheads among the trees, the cold demand for coin once again. If there was ever a creature born of the churning uncertainties of these centuries, it was Eustace Busquet, known to all as Eustace the Monk. Born around 1170 in Boulogne, on France's northern coast, Eustace seemed destined first for the quiet cloisters. As a young man, he took holy orders in the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Samer, his days filled with psalmody, illuminated texts, the disciplined hush of monastic life. But the peace of the monastery could not still whatever restless fires smouldered in Eustace's breast. Some say it was an inheritance dispute with the Count of Boulogne, some whisper darker scandals, petty fraud, or even dabbling in the black arts. Whatever the spark, it drove him out from under abbey arches and into the broader, perilous world. He shed the robe for the tunic of a bailiff, serving his powerful father's household, yet administrative life too proved a poor fit for his cunning and appetite. Accusations mounted of embezzlement or manipulation of local tax rolls, and so Eustace fled once more, slipping from the grasp of civil summons and pursuing lords alike, crossing from legitimacy into a life of open outlawry. The Channel beckoned him then, that heaving grey moat between France and England. There he found not only refuge, but opportunity. Eustace reinvented himself as a pirate captain, his ships quick and lean, crewed by loyal cutthroats who valued his sharp mind as much as his willingness to divide spoils generously. He stalked merchant lanes from the Thames estuary to the sands of Calais, seizing cargoes of cloth and salt, barrels of wine and salted herring. Ever adaptable, he made himself indispensable to powerful lords on both shores. At times he served King John of England as a privateer, harassing French coasters. At others he accepted the fleur-de-lis, raiding English ports and ferrying spies for the French crown. This shifting allegiance made him a phantom ally to every monarch, useful when paid, treacherous when slighted, always elusive. He became a legend whispered in the counting houses of Bruges and Rouen. Mind your ledgers, lest Eustace's sails blot out the sun. His mastery of the tides, the hidden shoals and swirling currents of the Channel, was near preternatural, giving rise to fresh rumours that he commanded dark powers learned in monastic vaults. Eustace's fame, or infamy, was anchored most firmly in the Channel Islands, the scattering of rocky havens that lay like stepping stones between Normandy and England. Guernsey and Sark, Jersey and Alderney, each became at one time or another a den for Eustace's fleet. There, in narrow coves, his ships could be careened and scraped free of barnacles. Crews could be paid and drunk into raucous loyalty. Spoils could be counted and divided under flaring torches. These harbours thrived on the fringe of law. Entire economies spun from smuggled casks and stolen silks. Local fishermen learned to look the other way, or to accept a cut of pirate silver for their silence. In taverns built almost into the very rock, sailors toasted Eustace's health, even as officials on the mainland posted rewards for his capture. He was no mere brute. Chronicles describe a man of considerable wit, capable of charming both noble patrons and salt-crusted mariners. His alliances were forged over flagons as often as with drawn blades, and he seemed always to keep a step ahead of any net cast to catch him. Yet the tides that served Eustace so well would at last turn against him. By 1215 the simmering hostilities between England and France had flared into open war again, pulling the pirate ever deeper into high politics. King John, desperate to hold his shaky crown, relied on Eustace to ferry troops and supplies across the Channel, trusting in his unmatched knowledge of these dangerous waters. But after John's death in 1216, his young heir Henry III inherited the throne under the watchful eye of regents eager to stabilise the realm. Suddenly, Eustace's web of shifting loyalties was seen not as clever manoeuvring, but as a threat to be cut clean away. It was during the negotiations surrounding the Treaty of Lambeth in 1217, meant to end French intervention and secure Henry's claim, that Eustace was finally cornered. His fleet, caught by English forces off Sandwich, was trapped in brutal boarding fights among the crests and troughs of a restless sea. There, amidst splintered decks and the iron reek of blood, the monk who became a pirate was captured at last. The chroniclers say he pleaded for his life, offering a ransom of immense size, but his captors, well acquainted with the treachery of his shifting loyalties, refused all entreaties. Eustace was taken to the deck of the English flagship. His hands were bound, his head forced down upon the rail, and there, beneath the sky he had so long commanded, wind heavy with salt and spray, the blade fell, ending the strange arc of a man who had once worn the serene cowl of Saint Benedict. Thus ended Eustace the monk. Yet the legend outlived him by centuries. Sailors spoke of seeing ghostly ships off Guernsey's cliffs, black sails filled by no earthly wind, and children playing on lonely beaches sometimes claimed to hear laughter, not gentle but edged with salt and iron, echoing across the tide-worn rocks. The early 14th century in England was an age of tremors. The Despencer War of 1321 to 1322, a baronial revolt against King Edward II and his despised favourites, left scars upon the realm. Powerful families had risen against the crown only to be crushed or forced into uneasy submission. Yet Edward's grip remained brittle, cracking under resentments that ran deep through the Midlands. Here, amid the rich patchwork of Leicester, Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, the rule of law was porous. Sheriffs were often compromised. Justices feared local magnates more than distant edicts. Into this volatile soil grew outlaw brotherhoods that were no mere brigand bands. They were blood-bound syndicates, drawing their strength from local gentry lineages. Among the most infamous were the Folvilles of Leicestershire and the Cotterells of the Derbyshire-Nottinghamshire borders. These were not ragged outcasts. They bore arms as knights and lesser squires, held manors, knew the labyrinthine ties of feudal loyalty. Yet when opportunities for gain or vengeance beckoned, they readily cast aside the crown's fragile statutes. For the Folvilles, outlawry often cloaked itself in the language of sacred duty. The patriarch had died leaving 7 sons, a tight cord of brothers who stood together whether to prosecute blood feuds or extort local rivals. Chroniclers sometimes softened their crimes, seeing in them instruments of a rough justice in a lawless land. The Cotterells, meanwhile, governed by pragmatic greed. Operating from the tangled woods and upland pastures of Derbyshire, they specialised in a brutal form of protection racket. Wealthy merchants or petty nobles who failed to pay found their herds driven off, their halls plundered, their kin kidnapped under cover of darkness. What gave these gangs such staying power was not merely swords, but structure. The Folvilles and Cotterells operated less like random bands of thieves and more like proto-mafias. Kinship lay at the heart. Brothers, cousins, trusted retainers bound by marriage or years of shared campaigns. Every manor, every croft under their influence served as safe house or listening post, and above all hovered the shield of the higher nobility. Lords embroiled in their own tangled disputes often found it useful to retain such bands for settling scores that formal courts could not. Even the church proved complicit. Abbots and rectors who owed favours or feared local power brokers offered sanctuary or turned a blind eye to stolen goods passing through the tithe barns. The Cotterells in particular excelled at leveraging fear. They would ride by night 20 or 30 strong, helmets covered by dark cloth, lances and cudgels gleaming under a cold moon. A discreet knock at the gate, a whispered warning, pay, or next time the torches would not stay unlit. The Folvilles, by contrast, clothed many of their deeds in the mantle of retribution. They claimed to pursue traitors to the community, corrupt sheriffs, or unjust creditors. Their name came to carry a paradoxical honour, half criminal, half avenger, which earned them popular support in many Midland villages. But perhaps the most stunning testament to their audacity came in 1332. That year, the Folville brothers, with their allies among the Cotterells, orchestrated the kidnapping of none other than Sir Richard de Willoughby, Chief Justice of the King's Bench. They seized him as he travelled the Nottingham roads, likely with minimal escort, underestimating the temerity of local bandits. Hustled away to some hidden manor or forest lodge, he was forced to dispatch frantic messages to family and colleagues. The ransom they demanded was monumental, 1,300 marks, a sum fit to finance small wars. It spoke to their sense not only of impunity, but of enterprise. And it worked. The money was raised, handed over in nervous transactions under the wary gaze of armoured retainers. Yet the episode also signalled a tightening noose. By kidnapping so prominent a figure, the Folvilles and Cotterells had crossed a threshold. The Crown could not entirely ignore such defiance without inviting collapse of its already fragile authority. Still, in the confused loyalties of these times, the same men who flouted the King's writ could find themselves courted by the King's captains only months later. In the shifting chessboard of medieval politics, yesterday's outlaw could become tomorrow's knight banneret. By the later 1330s, England found herself hungry for seasoned fighting men. The brewing conflicts on the continent, the tensions that would soon burst into the early campaigns of the 100 Years' War, demanded hardened troops. Here, the Crown discovered an ironic asset in these very kinship gangs it once sought to destroy. Men like the Cotterells and Folvilles were already practiced in the arts of ambush, siege, and intimidation. Their loyalty, so long bound to blood ties or local vendettas, could be bought, or more delicately, pardoned, in return for military service abroad. In 1333, Queen Philippa herself, acting in the king's stead during Edward III's campaigns, granted sweeping pardons to the Cotterell brothers. The price was simple: take up arms for the crown against the Scots. From the wooded ridges of Derbyshire to the harsh, heathered marches of Northumbria they rode, still led by their old kin leaders. Yet now their lances carried the royal standard. It was a transformation that did not escape the chroniclers of the time, who recorded with wry amazement how men once feared as extortionists became gallant captains on foreign soil. The Folvilles, too, found their path to legitimacy paved by military necessity. When Edward III called for levies and private retinues to swell his host, he was pragmatic enough to overlook old trespasses. Pardons flowed almost as campaign incentives: serve, and your past crimes would vanish beneath the heraldic surcoat. This practice was no mere accident of medieval governance. Across Europe, from France's free companies to the condottieri of Italy, outlaw warriors were routinely recycled as mercenaries, given official sanction so long as their swords served the right master. For the Folvilles and Cotterells, the shift was not merely political, but deeply personal. Pardoned, they could hold lands in peace, arrange marriages, and see their children rise without the taint of felony. Even local churchmen who once prayed for deliverance from their raids might now offer mass for their victories abroad. Yet not all stories found such neat redemptions. Richard Folville, the brother who often served as their spiritual as well as strategic guide, he was, paradoxically, a parish priest, met a bloody end around 1340. An ambush within the very sanctified walls of his church ended his career. The hand of royal justice, delayed but not denied, reached even into the chancel. Chroniclers describe him falling amidst the stone arches, blood mingling with holy oil, an unsettling tableau of crime and clerical office intertwined. Other Folvilles, however, fared far better. Eustace Folville, one of the most notorious brothers, managed not only to survive but to flourish under Edward III's campaigns. In time he was knighted, a striking transformation from the hunted outlaw who once abducted the Chief Justice of England. When he died peacefully in 1347, he left behind a legacy curiously balanced between infamy and honour. Local law remembered him as much for protecting villagers from harsher lords as for his earlier banditry. The Cotterells too melted seamlessly into respectability. Some became bailiffs, managing estates on behalf of major barons. Others found seats in Parliament, representing the very shires they once terrorised. It is a testament to the churn of medieval society, how quickly violence could be laundered by service, how easily yesterday's brigand became today's county magistrate. In this world of shifting allegiances and fragile monarchies, power, once seized, rarely asked for forgiveness, only a change of banners. By the early 16th century, the Anglo-Scottish border was a land apart, a place of ceaseless conflict, shifting loyalties, and a culture steeped in violence. The debatable lands, a stretch of territory roughly 50 miles long, lay between England and Scotland. Neither crown held full control here. Rather, the law belonged to those who could seize it by force. Among the most infamous figures to emerge from this wild frontier was Johnny Armstrong, a rogue, a raider, and to some, a folk hero. His red cloak and fiery hair marked him as a man both feared and respected. Armstrong and his band were no mere bandits. They were vassals of Lord Maxwell, a powerful Scottish nobleman who used them as instruments of power in the ongoing struggles against English authority. The Armstrongs specialised in what we would now call cross-border raiding, extorting the local populace, torching farms and abducting livestock and captives. These raids were brutal, swift and meticulously planned, exploiting the rugged terrain and the ever-shifting allegiances of border families. Armstrong's defiance was not simply criminal, it was political. He openly challenged the English wardens, royal officials appointed to keep peace in the border region. His actions tested the fragile border peace, embodying the tensions of a land where law was as fluid as the rivers cutting through the hills. But such daring inevitably invites retribution. In 1530, after years of eluding capture, Johnny Armstrong and 24 of his followers were seized during negotiations arranged under a false pretense by King James V of Scotland. Despite promises of safe conduct, Armstrong and his men were hanged without trial, a brutal end that reverberated across the border country. His execution extinguished one of the last great figures of border reaving, but it also transformed him into a lasting legend. In ballads passed down through generations, Johnny Armstrong's name became a symbol of resistance, a romantic outlaw who stood, however briefly, against the encroaching power of kings. Further west, in the rugged hills of mid-Wales, another chapter of outlawry unfolded, one steeped in blood, song and bitter local memory. It was here, near the village of Mordwy, that the Red Bandits earned their fearful name. These robbers, so called for their distinctive red hair, carved a reputation for ruthless highway robbery and murder. The local sheriff, Lewis Ape Owen, became their most infamous victim in 1555. The Red Bandits ambushed the sheriff, killing him in cold blood. a defiance that shook the foundations of local governance. This act was more than a simple crime. It was a direct challenge to royal authority in a region where the crown's reach was tenuous at best. The event spawned a rich tradition of ballads and poetry, memorializing the violence and lamenting the loss. These cultural artifacts paint a complex picture. The bandits as both feared criminals and tragic figures, caught in the cross currents of local grievances and national power. In the aftermath, the crown mounted reprisals to reassert control, leading to bloody confrontations and further entrenching the cycle of violence that marked the borderlands. Thus, across both the Anglo-Scottish borders and the wilds of Wales, the figure of the outlaw took on a complex life, neither wholly villain nor hero, but a mirror of the turbulent worlds they inhabited. Their stories, woven into the folklore and history of these regions, remind us that lawlessness often arises where authority falters, and that legends live on long after the swords have rusted. The Anglo-Scottish border was no mere line on a map. It was a living, breathing world, defined by its own customs, laws, and codes of honour. Here, the royal edicts of London or Edinburgh often held little sway. Instead, local families, clans, and kinship groups ruled through a complex web of loyalties and rivalries. The Armstrongs, the Elliots, the Grahams, these names evoke the very spirit of border reaving, a lifestyle where stealing cattle, raiding farms, and exacting blackmail were ways of life. Blackmail, derived from the Old English mail meaning rent or tribute, was essentially a protection racket, pay the reavers or suffer their wrath. This wasn't just crime, it was survival and status in a hostile landscape where famine, war, and harsh weather shaped every day. Retaliation was swift and brutal, feuds lasted generations. One border proverb captures the mindset: "One ye meet the reaver, ye must take the reaver's part." Loyalty was to family first, crown second. Amid this chaos, the line between outlaw and hero blurred. To the locals, a reaver might be a tyrant or a protector, sometimes both. It was a world where justice was personal and swift, where legal courts were distant, slow, and often powerless. Over the hills in Wales, the story of the Red Bandits of Mordwy took on a life beyond mere history. The murder of Sheriff Lewis ap Owen entered folk memory not just as a criminal act, but as a symbol of resistance against outside rule. The Welsh bardic tradition preserved these events through song and poetry, the mournful laments weaving fact and fiction into enduring narratives. These ballads, often performed at gatherings or during seasonal festivals, gave voice to the fears and hopes of the communities living under constant threat. In the oral tradition, the bandits became larger-than-life figures, fierce, red-haired spirits of the wild hills, fighting a shadow war against injustice and oppression. Yet, the ballads also carried warnings, reminding listeners of the price of violence and the fragile line between justice and revenge. These stories, passed from generation to generation, served as moral and cultural compasses, teaching lessons about loyalty, honor, and the consequences of lawlessness. Despite the enduring power of local customs and kinship ties, the English and Scottish crowns never ceased efforts to impose order on these unruly borderlands. Laws were passed, wardens appointed, and punitive expeditions launched. Yet the success was limited. Every attempt to clamp down on reaving often provoked more violence, driving families deeper into outlawry. The border reavers were masters of survival, exploiting the rugged terrain and divided loyalties to evade capture. The English government tried everything, from building fortified Pele towers to organising military patrols, but the reavers adapted, their clans stretching across both sides of the border, defying national boundaries. It was a place where the old and new worlds clashed. Medieval clan justice confronting the growing power of centralised monarchies. The border's history is a testament to the stubborn resilience of local identity and the enduring human impulse to resist outside control. The stories of border reavers and Welsh bandits did not fade into obscurity with their deaths and executions. Instead, they entered the realm of legend, their lives and deeds retold, reshaped by time, and immortalised in folklore, song, and literature. Johnny Armstrong, the Red Bandits of Mordwy, and countless others became symbols, embodiments of defiance, freedom, and the fierce protection of kin and land. To their communities, these outlaws were more than criminals. They were part of a shared identity forged in hardship. Their ballads and tales served as vessels for history, morality, and cultural pride, passed down through generations and influencing the collective imagination of the British Isles. These stories also highlight a deeper truth, that outlawry is as much a social condition as a criminal status, born of political failure and cultural complexity. Though these stories are rooted in the specific geography of the Anglo-Scottish border and Welsh hills, their themes resonate universally. They reflect the human struggle with authority, justice, and survival on the margins of society. As monarchies centralized power and expanded their reach, these last bastions of clan and kinship law gradually eroded, yet the legends they spawned endured, reminding us that history is not only made by kings and laws, but by those who challenge them. The border reavers and Welsh bandits of the 14th to 16th centuries offer us a vivid window into a world caught between the fading medieval past and the dawn of modernity. As political structures shifted and new forms of governance emerged, the faces of outlawry changed too, adapting to new challenges and new opportunities. What follows is a tale of evolution, of how outlaws transformed with the times, influencing the social, political, and cultural landscape of early modern Britain and Europe. From rural bandits to urban criminals, from feuding clans to organised crime, the story continues. While stories of noble outlaws and clan raiders captured the imagination, a harsher, less romantic reality played out in villages across England and Europe. These were the tales of common bandits, peasants and townsfolk who turned to crime not as a means of political defiance, but often sheer survival or desperate rebellion. In the 1260s, Bedfordshire bore witness to brutal gangs that preyed on the rural population. These were not knights or noblemen testing their fortunes, but groups of armed men who launched sudden, violent raids on small villages, attacking homes, stealing livestock, and sometimes murdering innocent villagers. The terror inflicted on these quiet communities was profound. Families lived in constant fear of nocturnal attacks. No one was truly safe in their own homes. This violence tore at the fragile fabric of medieval rural life, shaking trust and undermining local order. It is important to understand the sharp distinction between these common bandits and the more privileged, noble-born gangsters of earlier centuries. The latter often operated with some degree of impunity, protected by status and connections. The former were driven by different forces: poverty, displacement, and the chaotic aftermath of war or famine. Yet, regardless of their origins, both groups shared one fate: to exist on the fringes of law, hunted by authorities but sustained by the margins of society. Far to the southeast, across the great mountains and dense forests of the Balkans and Carpathians, a new form of outlawry took shape, that of the Haiduks and brigands. These figures emerged in the shadow of the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe and among the shifting powers of the Polish and Ruthenian borderlands. Haiduks were once mercenaries and soldiers, many of whom became displaced by war and political upheaval. They turned to banditry, attacking Ottoman supply lines, raiding estates, and sometimes kidnapping wealthy townsfolk for ransom. Unlike the brutal village gangs of England, Haiduks were often romanticized in the popular imagination, seen as brave rebels fighting against foreign oppression. They were freedom fighters in ballads and folk tales, celebrated for their daring raids and resistance to Ottoman rule. One notable figure from the Polish-Ruthenian borderlands was Fyodor Glowaty, a brigand whose exploits echoed through local history. Glowaty defied powerful estates, striking with boldness that earned him both fear and admiration. His band was known for seizing townspeople, holding them for ransom, a ruthless tactic, but one that underscored the fragile hold of the ruling classes in these contested borderlands. The Haiduks' lives were a continuous dance between violence and survival, hunted by imperial authorities, yet protected and celebrated by local peasants who saw in them symbols of hope and defiance. Their legends, like those of the Border Reivers and Welsh bandits, reflect a deeper narrative: that outlawry is often entwined with resistance against domination, and that the lines between villainy and heroism can shift with perspective. Across medieval Europe, banditry was not simply a crime, it was often a form of social protest. In times of hardship, war, or political turmoil, those pushed to the fringes, peasants, displaced soldiers, and dispossessed commoners, sometimes seized arms not only to survive but to challenge the status quo. This is a crucial lens to understand figures like the Haiduks or the Bedfordshire gangs. They were products of economic strain and political neglect. Their raids, kidnappings, and thefts were desperate responses to systems that offered them little justice or protection. Medieval societies were rigidly hierarchical, and the laws were often applied unevenly. The poor and powerless frequently faced harsh punishments for petty crimes, while nobles and officials might evade consequences altogether. Thus, banditry became a language of rebellion, a way to reclaim power, wealth, and dignity in a world that seemed stacked against them. While bandits terrorized villages, paradoxically, some also earned local sympathy or protection. In many cases, outlaws were seen not just as criminals but as folk heroes or champions of local grievances. This duality created a complex social dynamic. Authorities faced not only the criminals themselves, but also communities unwilling or unable to fully cooperate with law enforcement. Outlaws could rely on kinship ties, friendships, or shared resentment toward distant rulers to secure safe havens and aid. This relationship between bandits and their communities blurred the lines between lawfulness and lawlessness, and made the task of justice infinitely more complicated. By the late medieval period, many common bandits began to form more structured groups resembling early criminal organizations. These groups exploited not just rural villages, but also growing towns and trade routes. In England, for example, Highwaymen and forest outlaws would waylay travelers and merchants, extracting protection money or robbing caravans. Similarly, across Europe, criminal gangs began to develop networks and hierarchies. This evolution from scattered banditry to organized crime laid the groundwork for later urban gangs and mafia-like groups in the centuries to come. In Eastern Europe, the legacy of the haiduks and brigands persisted well beyond the medieval era. Their tales inspired nationalist movements, and their rebellious spirit became intertwined with struggles for independence and cultural identity. In Romanian, Serbian and Bulgarian folklore, these outlaws are remembered as defenders of the oppressed, with their legends influencing literature, music, and even political discourse. This enduring legacy underscores the deep cultural impact of banditry and outlawry, not merely as criminal phenomena, but as powerful social symbols. Faced with persistent banditry and social unrest, monarchs and governments began to adapt their strategies. Some outlaws were hunted mercilessly, subjected to harsh punishment or execution. Others were co-opted into official roles, offering pardons in exchange for military service or local policing. This pragmatic approach reflected the delicate balance between maintaining order and recognizing the limited reach of central authority in rural or contested regions. Figures who had once been enemies of the state could, through service and loyalty, reintegrate and even rise to positions of influence. Beyond their immediate impact on law and order, common bandits and folk rebels left an indelible mark on culture and collective memory. Their stories were told and retold, forming a rich tapestry of folklore that blurred the lines between villain and hero. In village songs, ballads, and oral traditions, bandits were cast both as scourges and as champions of justice, a duality reflecting the deep ambivalence societies held toward them. Such tales carried moral lessons, warning against lawlessness, yet also celebrating cunning, bravery, and resistance to tyranny. It was in this interplay of fear and admiration, repression and romanticization that outlawry persisted, not just as a crime, but as a cultural phenomenon. As Europe edged toward the Renaissance, increasing state centralization, improved law enforcement, and expanding bureaucracies gradually diminished the scope for medieval-style banditry. Yet the spirit of the outlaw endured, transforming and adapting to new contexts, moving from forest clearings and mountain hideouts to the shadowed alleys and taverns of growing towns and cities. The seeds planted by the common bandits and folk rebels of the medieval era would grow into the organized crime syndicates and social rebels of the early modern period. Thus, the story of common bandits is not merely one of destruction and chaos, but a chapter in the ongoing human drama of power, resistance, and survival. It is a story that invites us to look beyond simple labels of criminal or hero to understand the complex realities of history. With the medieval world changing around them, outlaws too would change. Their roles, identities, and the nature of their rebellion evolving in response to a world that was becoming more interconnected, more centralized, and more controlled. Across the centuries, the fierce figures who once terrorized and defied authority have undergone a remarkable transformation in the collective imagination. Those who were once hunted criminals, like the Folville Gang of England or Johnny Armstrong along the Anglo-Scottish border, have been reshaped into symbols of justice, resistance, and even heroism. This process of myth-making begins almost immediately after their deaths, as stories are told and retold by communities who long for champions to explain their struggles. The Folvilles, notorious for kidnapping judges and extorting nobles, gradually became entwined with the archetype of the noble outlaw, a figure who challenges corruption and defends the oppressed. Johnny Armstrong, once a feared border raider burning villages and extorting locals, became a folk hero in Scottish ballads, his daring and defiance romanticised despite the violence he inflicted. And so the line between outlaw and hero blurred, a shift from figures of fear to figures of hope. Perhaps no figure embodies this transformation more than Robin Hood, whose legend crystallized in the centuries following the medieval period. While rooted in historical memory of real outlaws, Robin Hood's story elevates the outlaw into a paragon of justice, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, and defying tyrannical authority. This archetype taps into deep societal desires for fairness and retribution, recasting acts once deemed criminal into forms of vigilantism. Over time, the deeds of many medieval outlaws have been reframed through this lens, revealing not only how societies remember the past, but also how they wish to see themselves. While folklore immortalized outlaws as heroes, medieval governments faced the raw realities of banditry with pragmatic strategies. The chaotic years of the Great Interregnum in the Holy Roman Empire gave rise to a particularly vivid example. The rise of the Raubritter, the robber knights who exploited political fragmentation to prey on commerce and travellers, forced city-states along the Rhine to unite and form the Rhine League. This league was an early attempt at collective security, an institutional lesson in the power of cooperation to suppress outlawry. It marked a turning point, demonstrating that bandit castles and robber barons could be dismantled through organised and sustained efforts. Beyond suppression, medieval rulers began to recognize the benefits of integrating outlaws into the established order. Pardons were offered in exchange for military service, as seen with England's Folville and Cotterell gangs, transforming former enemies into soldiers and administrators. This policy reflected a growing sophistication in governance, neutralizing threats by turning bandits into instruments of the Crown's authority. These strategies reveal a fundamental tension in medieval power, the need to balance justice and order with pragmatism and co-option. Outlaws could be crushed or harnessed. Either way, they shaped the political landscape. The legacy of medieval outlaws did not end with history books or folklore. Their images have echoed through the centuries, shaping how we imagine rebellion, justice, and crime today. The archetype of the noble outlaw influenced countless cultural works, from ballads to novels, and eventually to films and television. The story of Robin Hood inspired Hollywood classics, while the trope of the charismatic outlaw appears in westerns, gangster films, and beyond. This evolution invites us to consider the complex interplay between history and myth, fact and fiction. Outlaws remain symbols of the tension between danger and rebellion, between society's need for order and individuals' quest for freedom. Their stories continue to captivate us because they speak to something universal: the struggle against oppression, the allure of the forbidden, and the hope for justice outside the law. As we look across the centuries, we see how deeply the outlaw's shadow stretches into our collective imagination. It is there in the enduring fascination with men who live by their own codes, who stand at the fringes of accepted society, daring to challenge those in power. Medieval outlawry planted these seeds. Whether it was the audacious raids of the Folville gang or Johnny Armstrong's fiery campaigns on the Scottish border, each left behind stories ripe for reinterpretation. In the centuries that followed, bards and writers seized upon these figures, not merely to recount their crimes, but to use them as mirrors to society's fears and hopes. Robin Hood, of course, is the brightest of these reflections, but countless other tales grew from the same soil. Tales of noble bandits who rob the corrupt and give to the oppressed, who defy unjust kings or greedy landlords. With every telling, these outlaws were polished a little more brightly, their sins softened, their virtues magnified. Soon they were no longer mere bandits fleeing justice, but champions of a higher justice, folk heroes who lived by an unwritten moral code. It is a transformation both subtle and profound, revealing how societies reinterpret the lawless when seeking meaning in their own struggles. And so the medieval world bequeathed to us more than historical records of crime and punishment. It gave us a psychological landscape where the outlaw continues to roam. We see it today in films where rugged anti-heroes challenge corrupt systems, in novels where charismatic criminals expose societal rot, in songs that romanticize rebellion. The outlaw is both a warning and a promise, a cautionary figure of chaos, yet also a dream of freedom, unrestrained by authority. This dance of law and lawlessness is as old as civilization itself. In medieval Europe it was played out in forests, castles and village squares. Today it plays out on our screens and in our imaginations. In the end, the stories of outlaws are less about the individuals themselves and more about us, our fears of disorder, our resentment of oppression, our yearning for justice even outside the bounds of law. That is why the outlaw endures, not only as a figure in dusty chronicles, but as a living presence in our myths, our media, and our very sense of who we are. It is why the rough legacy of medieval bandits still resonates, why the songs of Johnny Armstrong are still sung in border towns, why Robin Hood's green figure still haunts the edge of Sherwood, and why the idea of the rebel hero continues to shape the stories we tell ourselves. From the shadowed keeps of robber knights along the Rhine, to the bustling markets once terrorized by the Folvilles, to the smoky hearths where ballads of Armstrong and the Red Bandits of Maudoui were whispered, the outlaw remains with us, a mirror of our contradictions, a ghost of our longings, a legend forever just beyond the edge of the law. The medieval world, in all its brutal and unyielding complexity, reminds us that justice is never simple. It is a dance of power and mercy, fear and forgiveness, order and chaos, carried out not only by kings and courts, but by communities, by faith, by the stories we tell ourselves about right and wrong. And yet, the story does not end there. Just as outlaws transformed into folk heroes, so too did society itself begin to transform, its notions of crime and punishment bending under the weight of new ideas. As kingdoms grew into nations, as feudal customs gave way to codified laws, the raw spectacle of public executions and corporal torment slowly yielded to more structured systems. Courthouses replaced the arbitrary justice of manor halls. Prisons with all their flaws emerged as the new theatres of punishment and, eventually, of attempted rehabilitation. In another video we will tell not of those who fled justice, but of how justice itself fled from the iron teeth of medieval cruelty toward the grey walls of penitentiaries. How societies reimagined their moral debts, the human body, and the very meaning of redemption. Glad you made it till the end. Farewell, dear listener. Until next video.